The music stopped the moment Damon Voss raised his hand. Every guest in the great hall of Blackthorn Pack turned toward the raised platform, where the bonding ceremony was supposed to take place. Candles lined the walls. Silver ribbons hung from the ceiling. Everything had been prepared for a joining, not for what was about to happen. Serafina Cole stood in the center of the platform in a pale blue dress, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for the words that would make her Luna of the strongest pack in the Northern Territory. She had waited for this moment since she was 16 years old, since the day the bond first pulled at her chest and told her that Damon Voss was her fated mate. She did not expect him to step back from her. "I cannot do this," Damon said. His voice carried across the silent hall. "I reject you, Serafina Cole. I reject the bond between us." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a glass fell and shattered on the stone floor, but no one moved to pick it up. Every eye stayed fixed on the platform, on the Alpha and the woman he had just cast aside in front of 300 witnesses. Serafina did not move. For one long second, she simply looked at him, as though she were waiting for him to laugh, to say this was some cruel joke meant to test her. But Damon's face held no humor. His jaw was tight. His eyes, the same golden eyes that used to soften whenever he looked at her, were cold and certain. "You are not what I need," he continued, quieter now, but not quiet enough. "You have never been what I need." Behind him, near the edge of the platform, a woman stepped forward. She wore a red dress that stood out sharply against the pale colors of the ceremony, her dark hair pinned back, her expression calm in a way that told Serafina she had known this moment was coming. This was Elise Whitmore. A human woman. Someone Serafina had seen only a handful of times, always at the edge of pack gatherings, always close to Damon, always smiling at him in a way that made Serafina's stomach turn, even before she understood why. "I have chosen Elise," Damon said. "She is who I want beside me, not you." The words landed like physical blows. Serafina felt the bond between them, the invisible thread that had connected her heart to his since she was 16, tear apart inside her chest. It was not a metaphor. It was a real and physical pain, like something inside her had been ripped loose and left bleeding. She staggered back a step, one hand pressing against her ribs, but she did not fall. She would not fall. Not here. Not in front of all of them. "Damon," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You do not mean this." "I do. The pack will not accept a human Luna. You know this. The council will never allow it." "Then the council can find someone else to lead them," Damon said, and there was a flatness in his voice that told her he had already made peace with whatever consequences might come. "I will not spend my life bonded to someone I do not want." Serafina looked past him, at the faces in the crowd. She saw pack members she had known her whole life, people she had trained beside, people whose children she had helped deliver, people who had called her friend. Not one of them stepped forward to speak for her. Fear held them still. To challenge an Alpha's decision, even a cruel one, was to invite punishment, and no one in that hall was willing to risk it, not even for her. "Take off the mark," Damon said. He gestured toward her wrist, where a faint silver marking curled beneath her skin, the physical sign of the bond that had once existed between them. "It means nothing now." Serafina looked down at her wrist. The mark was already fading, the silver threads dimming as the bond dissolved. She had not asked for this. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she was the one being erased, the one being asked to disappear quietly so that Damon could have the life he wanted. She lifted her chin. "I will not beg you," she said. "Not now. Not ever." Something flickered across Damon's face, something that might have been surprise, or perhaps a flash of the boy she used to know, before power and expectation hardened him into this cold stranger. But it passed quickly, replaced again by that same distant certainty. "Then leave," he said. "You are no longer welcome on Blackthorn land. Your title is gone. Your place here is gone." The council elder standing near the edge of the platform, an old wolf named Corwin who had known Serafina since she was a child, opened his mouth as if to object, but one look from Damon silenced him. No one in that hall had the courage to stand against their Alpha, not even for the woman who had been meant to rule beside him. Serafina walked off the platform alone. The crowd parted for her, but no one reached out. No one offered comfort. She walked through the doors of the great hall, and out into the cold night air, and only when the doors closed behind her did she allow herself to stop, to press both hands against the stone wall of the entrance, and to breathe through the pain still tearing through her chest. She did not cry. She refused to give Damon that victory, even from a distance, even where he could not see her. Instead, she straightened her spine, wiped the dampness from her eyes before it could fall, and began walking toward the small cottage at the edge of Packland that had been hers since childhood. She would gather what little she needed. She would leave before sunrise. She would not wait for the pack to decide what further humiliation they might heap upon her. The cottage was dark and quiet when she arrived. She lit a single candle and moved through the rooms methodically, taking only what she could carry: a cloak, a pair of sturdy boots, a small pouch of coins she had saved over the years, a knife her grandmother had given her, the only piece of family she had left. She did not take anything that reminded her of Damon. She left behind the small wooden carving he had given her the year the bond first formed, left it sitting on the windowsill where morning light would eventually find it and mean nothing to anyone. By the time she stepped outside again, the sky had begun to lighten at the edges, a thin gray promise of dawn. She did not look back at the Packlands as she walked away. She did not look back at the great hall, or the cottage, or the life she had spent years building around the expectation of becoming Luna. She simply walked, one foot in front of the other, until the trees of Blackthorn territory gave way to unfamiliar woods, and the borders of the only home she had ever known disappeared behind her. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. The forest beyond Blackthorn territory was quieter than she expected, and colder. Seraphina walked for hours without direction, her mind still numb from the shock of the ceremony, from the sudden and total collapse of the future she had been promised her entire life. Every step forward felt like walking through water, heavy and slow, as though her body had not yet caught up with what her heart already understood. She was alone now, truly alone, in a way she had never been before. By midday, hunger began to gnaw at her, sharp and insistent, but she had brought no food, only coins that would do her no good, in the middle of a forest with no village in sight. She found a stream and drank from it, cupping the cold water in her hands, and pressed on, telling herself that somewhere ahead there had to be a town, a farmhouse, some sign of civilization where she could trade her coins for bread and a place to sleep. The bond's absence was the hardest part. She had lived with that invisible thread for 6 years, had grown so used to its quiet presence in the back of her mind that she had stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing the sound of their own heartbeat. Now its absence was deafening. Every so often she would reach for it out of habit, some small part of her still expecting to feel Damon's presence there, and each time she found nothing, the loss hit her fresh, as sharp as it had been the moment he spoke the words that ended it. She pushed the pain down. She had learned long ago, growing up as an orphan on the edges of the pack, raised more by circumstance than by any loving family, that grief was a luxury she could not always afford. Survival came first. Feeling came later, if there was room left for it. As the sun began its slow descent behind the treetops, Seraphina's steps grew unsteady. The broken bond had left her weaker than she wanted to admit, her body still adjusting to the sudden absence of a connection that had once lent her strength she never fully understood she was borrowing. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her legs trembled with each step. She told herself she only needed to find somewhere safe to rest, just for the night, and in the morning, she would continue on with a clearer head. She did not make it to nightfall. Her foot caught on a root hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves, and she went down hard, her knees striking the earth, her palms scraping against rock and bark as she tried to catch herself. Pain flared through her hands and knees, but it was distant somehow, muffled beneath the deeper exhaustion pressing down on her whole body. She tried to push herself back up, and found she did not have the strength. The forest around her began to blur, the greens and browns bleeding together into a haze. She thought, distantly, that this was a foolish way to end things, collapsed in the dirt of an unfamiliar wood, because she had been too proud to ask anyone for help before she left. She thought of the cottage windowsill, the small wooden carving she had left behind. She thought, briefly and without meaning to, of Damon's face in the moment before he spoke the words that ended everything, and wondered if some part of him had felt anything at all. Then the world went dark, and she knew nothing more. When awareness returned, it came slowly, in pieces. First there was warmth, a fire crackling somewhere nearby, its heat reaching her skin in gentle waves. Then there was the scent of wood smoke, and something else beneath it, something clean and unfamiliar. Then there was the hard but not unkind surface beneath her, a bedroll laid over packed earth, a rough wool blanket pulled up to her shoulders. Serafina opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the flickering orange light of a small fire. She was inside some kind of shelter, simple and sturdy, built from timber and stone, with a single window letting in the last gray light of evening. She tried to sit up, and a wave of dizziness forced her back down. "Easy," a voice said, low and even, from somewhere near the fire. "You collapsed in the woods. You have been asleep for almost a full day." Serafina turned her head toward the voice, and found a man sitting a short distance away, tending to the fire with slow, practiced movements. He was tall. Even seated she could tell that much from the length of his frame, with dark hair that fell just past his jaw, and a face marked by a long scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were a deep gray, calm and unreadable, giving away nothing of what he might be thinking. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Kale," he said simply, offering nothing further. No surname, no title, no explanation of what he was doing alone in these woods, or why he had chosen to help a stranger he found unconscious among the trees. "Where am I?" "Neutral ground," Kale said. "Between territories, no pack claims this land." Serafina pushed herself up slowly this time, and though the dizziness returned, it was manageable now, and she was able to remain upright, the blanket pooling around her waist. She studied the small shelter around her, noting the simplicity of it, the lack of any pack markings or symbols that might tell her who this man belonged to, if he belonged to anyone at all. "Thank you," she said finally, "for finding me." "For this." She gestured vaguely at the fire, the shelter, the blanket. Kale said nothing in response, only gave a small nod, and returned his attention to the fire, adding another piece of wood, watching the flames catch and grow. There was something in his silence that Serafina found strange, not unfriendly exactly, but guarded, as though he had long ago decided that words were a currency to be spent carefully, and he saw no reason to spend more than necessary on a stranger he had pulled from the forest floor. She did not press him for more. She had no strength for conversation, and something in his manner told her that questions would not be welcomed, not yet. Instead, she lay back down, pulled the blanket up again, and allowed the warmth of the fire, and the exhaustion in her body, to pull her back toward sleep, grateful, for the first time, in what felt like a very long time, that she had not been left alone in the dark, to face whatever might have come next. The days that followed, blurred together, in a slow, careful rhythm. Kale's shelter was small but well kept, tucked into a hillside where the trees grew thick enough to hide it from any casual traveler. He hunted in the early mornings, and returned with rabbits or fish, cooking them over the fire without much conversation, offering Serafina a share without ever asking anything of her in return. She healed slowly, the physical wounds from her fall fading within days, though the deeper wound, the tear left behind by the broken bond, lingered in a way that made her tired in ways sleep could not fix. She learned small things about him through observation rather than conversation, since he offered almost nothing willingly. He moved through the forest with a silence that suggested years of practice, his steps leaving barely a mark on the ground, even when he carried the weight of a fresh kill over his shoulder. He never raised his voice, not once, not even when a storm rolled through on the third night, and a falling branch nearly struck the shelter's roof. He simply moved to secure what needed securing, calm and unhurried, as though nothing in the world could truly surprise him anymore. On the fourth day, as she sat outside the shelter watching him clean a fish he had caught that morning, Serafina finally found the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in her mind since she first woke. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You did not know me. You owed me nothing." Kale did not look up from his work. "You needed help," he said. "That was enough reason. Most people would not have stopped." "Then most people are wrong," Kale said, and something in the flatness of his tone told her this was not a philosophy he had adopted recently, but a belief carved into him by something older, something he had no intention of explaining further. Serafina studied him for a long moment, taking in the scar along his cheek, the quiet economy of his movements, the way his gray eyes seemed to hold something guarded and watchful, even in the stillness of an ordinary afternoon. She thought of Damon, of the golden eyes that had once looked at her with warmth and now looked at her with nothing at all, and found it strange that a stranger's simple kindness felt more real to her in 4 days than 6 years of promises had ever managed to feel. "I should not stay here much longer," she said. "I have imposed on you enough." For the first time since she had woken in his shelter, Cale looked up and met her eyes directly, and something in his gaze made her breath catch, though she could not have said exactly why. "You are not imposing," he said. "Stay as long as you need." Serafina did not have anywhere else to go, no pack to return to, no family waiting for her, no plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and the life that had rejected her. And so, against the careful independence she had built for herself over a lifetime of relying on no one but herself, she nodded, and stayed, and told herself it would only be for a little while longer, not yet realizing how much that decision would come to change everything that followed. On the 6th day, Serafina woke before dawn to find the shelter empty. Cale's bedroll was neatly folded near the cold hearth, and there was no sign of him outside, no fresh tracks near the tree line, nothing to indicate where he had gone, or when he might return. She told herself this was not her concern. He had disappeared before, always briefly, always returning within a few hours with something useful, a fresh catch, a bundle of herbs, a length of rope. She busied herself with small tasks, rebuilding the fire, sweeping the dirt floor with a bundle of dry branches, anything to keep her hands moving, and her mind away from the ache that still lived in her chest. By mid-morning, when he had still not returned, a small worry began to creep into her thoughts, though she could not explain why she cared. He was a stranger, he owed her nothing beyond the kindness he had already shown, and she owed him nothing in return except gratitude, and eventually distance, once she found the strength to continue on her own path. And yet she found herself standing at the edge of the clearing more than once, scanning the tree line, listening for footsteps that did not come. He returned just before noon, moving through the trees with the same silent grace she had come to expect, though this time there was something different in the way he carried himself, a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. He said nothing as he approached the shelter, only knelt by the dead fire and began rebuilding it with quick, efficient movements, his jaw set tight. "Is something wrong?" Serafina asked. Cale did not answer immediately. He struck a spark into the kindling, coaxed it into a small flame, and only then did he look up at her. "There were wolves near the eastern border," he said. "Scouts, most likely, from one of the packs that claims land near here." "Scouts looking for what?" "I do not know," Cale said, though something in the careful way he said it made her wonder if that was entirely true. "It is not the first time. Packs send scouts along neutral ground sometimes, to see who passes through, who might be worth watching." Serafina felt a small chill run through her, unrelated to the temperature of the morning air. "Do you think they saw you?" "They did not," Cale said, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "I made sure of that." She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand why a man living alone in unclaimed territory would need to move with such caution around wandering scouts, why the tension in his shoulders had not fully eased, even now that he sat by the fire with breakfast in his hands. But something in his expression told her the conversation had reached its natural end, that further questions would only be met with silence, and so she let it go, filing the moment away with the small collection of strange details she had already gathered about the man who had saved her life. As the days stretched into a second week, Serafina found her strength slowly returning. The ache from the broken bond had not disappeared, and she suspected it never fully would, but it had settled into something more bearable, a dull weight she carried, rather than a fresh wound that reopened with every breath. She began helping Cale with small tasks around the shelter, gathering firewood, tending the small fire he used for cooking, mending a tear in one of his cloaks with a needle and thread she found among his sparse belongings. He never asked her to help. She simply began doing it, filling the quiet hours with purpose, and he never objected, only nodded his thanks, in that same economical way he did everything else. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of roasted rabbit and foraged greens, Serafina found herself studying him again, the way she often did when she thought he was not paying attention. There was something about him that did not fit the picture of a simple traveler living alone on neutral ground. His movements were too precise, too controlled. like someone who had spent years training a body that might otherwise have moved with careless abandon. His awareness of his surroundings was constant, his eyes flicking toward the tree line every few minutes, even in the middle of conversation, as though some part of him never fully rested, never fully trusted the stillness of an ordinary evening. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Cale glanced at her, his expression neutral. "You can ask. Why do you live out here alone? No pack, no village, nothing but this shelter, and the woods around it." For a long moment he did not answer, and Serafina thought perhaps she had finally asked the one question that would earn her only silence. But then he set down the piece of bread he had been holding, and looked into the fire, his expression distant in a way she had not seen before. "There are reasons," he said finally. "Old ones. Not ones I am ready to speak of." "That is fair," Serafina said, and meant it. She, of all people, understood the weight of carrying things one was not ready to speak of. She had not told him the full story of why she had been alone and collapsing in the woods when he found her, only the barest outline, that she had left a pack she no longer belonged to, that there was no one left behind who would come looking for her. He had not pressed for more, and she found she respected him for that, this unspoken agreement between them, that neither would demand more of the other than they were willing to give. "You do not ask many questions," she said instead, "about where I came from, what happened to me." "It is not my business," Cale said simply. "If you wish to tell me, I will listen. If you do not, that is your right." Serafina looked down at the fire, watching the flames curl around a fresh piece of wood, and found herself, unexpectedly, wanting to tell him. Not all of it, not yet, but some small piece of the truth, enough to explain the shape of the wound she still carried. "I was meant to be a Luna," she said quietly. "My mate rejected me, in front of everyone, chose someone else instead, a human woman, and cast me out of the pack with nothing." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, bracing herself for pity, or worse, for the kind of polite discomfort people often showed when confronted with another person's pain, the awkward search for words that might fix something that could not be fixed. But Cale's expression did not shift into pity. Instead, something harder moved behind his gray eyes, something that looked almost like anger, though it was carefully controlled, banked down the way he seemed to control everything about himself. "He was a fool," Cale said, and there was a weight behind the words that surprised her, as though he were not simply offering comfort, but stating a fact he found self-evident. Any alpha who rejects a bonded mate in front of his pack, and for no fault of hers, is not fit to lead. "You do not know him," Serafina said. "You do not know the full story." "I know enough," Cale said. "A mate bond is not something to be discarded because someone grows tired of it, or because someone else catches an alpha's eye. It is a bond meant to be honored. What he did to you was not a small cruelty. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind." Serafina felt something loosen in her chest at his words, some tight and guarded place she had not realized she was holding closed, until this stranger, this quiet man who asked for nothing and offered everything, spoke the truth of what had happened to her so plainly, without hesitation, without the careful diplomacy everyone in her old pack had used to avoid naming Damon's cruelty for what it was. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saying that." Cale held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them in the firelight, something Serafina could not quite name, but felt in the quiet of her chest, a warmth entirely different from the cold ache the broken bond had left behind. Then he looked away, back toward the fire, and the moment passed, though it did not disappear entirely. It settled somewhere beneath the surface, waiting.
"You should rest,"
Cale said. "Tomorrow I will show you how to set a snare, if you wish to learn. It will serve you well, wherever you decide to go next." Serafina nodded, though something in her had already begun to wonder whether she wanted to go anywhere else at all. She lay down that night, beneath the same rough blanket that had covered her the first night she woke in his shelter, listening to the quiet crackle of the dying fire, and for the first time since the ceremony that had shattered her old life, she fell asleep without dreaming of Damon's cold golden eyes, without feeling the phantom ache of a bond that no longer existed. She dreamed instead of gray eyes and quiet strength, of a man who asked nothing of her and gave everything freely, and she did not yet understand how deeply that dream would come to shape everything still to come. The peace did not last. 3 nights later, Serafina woke to the sound of Cale's voice, low and urgent, calling her name from just outside the shelter. She sat up immediately, every nerve in her body snapping to alertness, the years of pack training she had absorbed, even without a title, rising to the surface at once. "Stay low," Cale said, as she pushed through the doorway. "Do not make a sound." She did not ask questions. She dropped to a crouch beside him, following his gaze toward the tree line, where the moonlight caught the outline of shapes moving between the trunks, too large and too deliberate to be deer, too many to be a single lost traveler. Wolves, 4 of them, moving with the coordinated purpose of a hunting patrol, their scent carried on the night wind, sharp and unfamiliar. "They are not from Blackthorn," Cale murmured, his voice barely above a breath. "Different scent markers. Southern territory, I think. They should not be this far north." "What do they want?" "I do not know. But we are not going to wait here to find out." Serafina's heart pounded as she watched the shapes drift closer, weaving between the trees with the unhurried confidence of wolves who believed they had no reason to fear whatever they might find. She thought of the knife her grandmother had given her, still tucked into the small pack she kept beside her bedroll, and wished fiercely that she had thought to bring it out here with her. Cale moved without warning, pulling her back from the doorway and further into the shadow of the hillside where the shelter had been built, his hand firm but careful around her arm. "There is a hollow behind the rocks, 20 paces west," he whispered. "Go there now. Stay low, stay silent, and do not come out until I come for you. What about you?" "I will draw them away if I need to. Go." Serafina hesitated only a moment before the sound of a low growl, carried faintly on the wind from the direction of the tree line, sent her moving. She kept low, exactly as he had instructed, weaving through brush and around the jagged edge of stone outcroppings, until she found the hollow he had described, a narrow gap between 2 boulders, just wide enough for a person to press themselves into and disappear from sight. She pushed herself into the gap, drew her knees to her chest, and forced her breathing into something slow and controlled, though her heart continued to hammer against her ribs. Minutes passed like hours. She strained to hear anything beyond the sound of her own pulse in her ears, catching fragments of movement somewhere near the shelter, the faint snap of a branch, the low murmur of voices that were not quite words, too distant to make out clearly. She thought of Cale alone out there, facing 4 unknown wolves with nothing but whatever weapon he might be carrying, and found herself gripping the edge of the boulder so tightly her knuckles ached. Then, abruptly, the voices stopped. Silence stretched long and taut across the clearing, broken only by the whisper of wind through the treetops. Serafina held herself perfectly still, counting the seconds, unsure whether the quiet meant danger had passed, or simply that it had drawn closer without her hearing it approach. She thought of every worst possibility, that the scouts had found Cale, that something had happened to him in the darkness while she hid, safe and useless, behind a wall of stone. Just when she thought she could not bear the silence any longer, she heard footsteps, familiar and even, moving toward the hollow where she hid. She tensed, one hand instinctively reaching for a loose rock beside her, ready to defend herself if the footsteps belonged to someone else. "It is me," Cale's voice said quietly, just before he appeared at the gap between the boulders. "You can come out. They are gone." Serafina let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and pushed herself out of the hollow, her legs stiff from crouching so long in the cold. "What happened? Did they see you?" "They saw enough to decide this was not worth the trouble," Cale said, and something in the careful way he phrased it told her there was more to the story than he was willing to share, at least for tonight. "They will not trouble us again. Not here. You are certain?" "I am certain," he said, and the flat confidence in his voice left no room for argument, though it did nothing to answer the growing list of questions building in her mind. What kind of man sent 4 armed scouts retreating into the night, with nothing more than a few words and a confrontation she had not been allowed to witness? What kind of reputation did a lone traveler carry, that 4 wolves from an unfamiliar southern pack would simply turn and leave, rather than press whatever advantage they believed they held? She did not ask, not that night. She could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself as they walked back toward the shelter together, and she understood, without needing to be told, that whatever had happened out there in the dark had cost him something, even if he was not yet willing to name what. They sat together by the rekindled fire until the sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn, neither of them speaking much, both simply grateful for the other's presence in the aftermath of danger neither had fully understood. Serafina found herself watching him more closely than before, cataloging the small details she had gathered over the past weeks, the scar along his cheekbone, the controlled precision of every movement, the way even strangers in the dark seemed to sense something in him worth avoiding. Whoever Cale truly was, she was beginning to understand that the quiet, scarred man who had pulled her from the forest floor and asked for nothing in return was not simply a traveler passing through neutral land. He was something more. Something the world outside this small hillside shelter had reason to fear, or perhaps to respect, in ways she was only beginning to glimpse. And as the sun rose fully over the treetops, casting long golden light across the clearing, where danger had stood only hours before, Serafina made a quiet decision. She would stay a little longer, not simply because she had nowhere else to go, but because some instinct deep inside her, the same instinct that had once told her Damon was her fated mate, was now telling her something entirely different about the man beside her, something she did not yet have words for, but that she could no longer ignore. The scent of smoke woke Serafina before dawn, sharp and wrong, cutting through the usual quiet of the shelter. She sat up fast, heart pounding, and found the space beside the fire empty. Cale's bedroll lay undisturbed. His cloak still hung from the peg near the door. She was alone. Outside, the sky held that strange gray color between night and morning, and the wind carried the smoke smell more strongly, drifting from somewhere beyond the ridge to the east. Serafina grabbed her knife from beside her bedroll and stepped outside, scanning the tree line, listening for any sound that might explain what was happening. A twig snapped behind her. She spun, knife raised, and found Cale standing a few paces away, his expression unreadable, a thin line of blood drying along his forearm. "You are hurt," she said, lowering the knife. "It is nothing," Cale said, though the way he held his arm slightly away from his body told a different story. "There was a fire on the ridge, lightning, most likely. I made sure it would not spread this way." Serafina studied him carefully, noting the tension still coiled in his shoulders, the alertness in his eyes that had not fully faded even now that he stood safely in the clearing. She did not fully believe the explanation, not after the scouts 3 nights before, not after everything she had learned about how carefully this man guarded the truth of who he was, and what threats might be circling closer than he wanted her to know. But she also understood, by now, that pressing him would earn her nothing but silence, and so she simply reached for the small bag of herbs she had gathered the week before, and gestured for him to sit. "Let me clean that at least," she said. Cale hesitated only a moment before lowering himself onto the log near the fire pit, extending his arm without further argument. Serafina knelt beside him, unwrapping the makeshift bandage he had tied around the wound, and found a shallow but ugly gash running along the outside of his forearm, the kind of wound left by claws rather than any accident of fire or falling branch. She said nothing about it. She simply cleaned it with water and crushed herbs, wrapped it properly, and tied it off with more care than the situation strictly required, aware the whole time of how still he held himself under her hands, how his eyes tracked her face rather than her work. "Thank you," Cale said quietly, once she had finished. "You should tell me the truth someday," she said, not looking up from tying off the last of the bandage, "about what you are really protecting this land from." "Someday," Cale agreed, and though his voice gave nothing away, something in the word felt like a promise rather than a deflection, and Serafina found herself surprisingly willing to accept it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Neither of them spoke about directly, but both seemed to understand. Serafina no longer spoke of leaving. Cale no longer offered directions to the nearest village, or hinted that she might be better served finding a new life elsewhere. They simply continued, day after day, building something neither of them named, though it grew steadier and warmer with each passing week, like a fire built slowly from careful, patient tending. She learned to set snares, exactly as he had promised the night before the scouts came, her hands clumsy at first, and growing surer with practice, until she could catch a rabbit as reliably as he could. She learned to identify which plants along the forest floor could heal a wound, and which could poison a careless traveler who mistook one leaf for another. She learned, slowly, The particular quiet language of his silences, the difference between the stillness that meant he was simply thinking and the stillness that meant something in the forest had caught his attention and required watching. And in turn, though she never asked him to, Cale began to open in small, careful pieces. He told her, one evening while repairing a torn strap on his boot, about a childhood spent moving between territories, never settling long enough in one place to call it home. He told her, another night, about losing people he cared for to violence he refused to describe in detail, his jaw tightening in a way that told her the wound, whatever it had been, had never fully closed. He never told her his last name. He never told her which pack, if any, he had once belonged to, or why the wolves who came scouting through neutral territory seemed to know enough about him to retreat rather than risk a confrontation. Serafina found she did not mind the gaps in what he shared. She had her own gaps, after all, pieces of her history she was not yet ready to lay bare, memories of 6 years spent hoping for a future that had crumbled to nothing in a single humiliating night. It was enough, for now, to sit beside someone who did not demand more of her than she was willing to give, who filled the silence between them with something that felt, increasingly, like understanding rather than distance. One clear evening, weeks into her stay, they sat outside the shelter, watching the last light fade from the sky, the first stars beginning to prick through the deepening blue above the treetops. Serafina had grown stronger by then, the physical weakness from the broken bond long since faded, replaced by a quiet resilience she had not known she still possessed, until circumstances forced her to find it again. "Can I ask you something?" Cale said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "You can ask," Serafina said, echoing the words he had once given her, and caught the faint curve of something that might have been amusement, pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Do you still think of him? Your former mate?" The question landed gently, without judgment, and Serafina considered it honestly before answering, turning the question over in her mind, the way she had learned to turn over questions that mattered, rather than answering too quickly. "Less than I did," she said finally. "The bond is gone completely now. I do not feel the ache of it anymore, not the way I did those first weeks, but I still think of the humiliation sometimes. Not him, exactly. What he did. How no one in that hall spoke a word in my defense." "They were afraid," Cale said. "Fear makes people small. It does not excuse them, but it explains them." "I know," Serafina said. "I have made peace with that, mostly. It is harder to make peace with the part of myself that still wonders what was wrong with me, why I was not enough for him to choose." Cale turned to look at her fully then, his gray eyes steady in the fading light. "There was nothing wrong with you," he said, each word deliberate, carrying a weight that told her he had considered this carefully, rather than offering easy comfort. He was not capable of recognizing what he had. "That is a failure of his character, not a flaw in yours." Something in Serafina's chest loosened at the certainty in his voice, the complete absence of hesitation, as though the truth of what he said was as plain to him as the stars now scattering across the darkening sky. She had spent weeks slowly rebuilding her sense of self after Damon's rejection had tried to hollow it out, and yet no words from anyone, not even her own careful self-talk in the quiet hours before sleep, had settled the doubt as thoroughly as Cale's simple, unwavering certainty. "You say that with a great deal of confidence," she said, "for someone who barely knew me before I collapsed at your feet." "I know enough," Cale said. "I have watched you these past weeks. You do not complain when the work is hard. You do not ask for more than your fair share. You face fear honestly, instead of pretending it does not exist. Those are not small things. Any alpha who could not see the value in that was never worthy of the position he holds." Serafina felt heat rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar and welcome after so many weeks of numbness, and looked away, toward the fire, rather than let him see the full effect of his words.
"You speak like someone who understands leadership,"
she said, half teasing, half genuinely curious. For a man who claims to want nothing to do with packs or politics. Something shifted in Cale's expression, quick and gone before she could fully read it, a flicker of caution reasserting itself after the openness of the moment before. "I have seen enough leadership, good and bad, to know the difference," he said, carefully vague, and Serafina recognized the return of the wall he kept around certain parts of himself, the same wall that had stood firm every time she asked too directly about his past. She let the subject drop, as she always did, trusting that whatever truth he was protecting would surface in its own time, when he judged the moment right. She had learned, in the weeks since he pulled her from the forest floor, that patience with Cale yielded far more than pressure ever could. The following morning brought a different kind of disturbance. Not danger this time, but news. Cale returned from an early scouting trip along the border of neutral land, with a folded piece of parchment in hand, his expression troubled in a way Serafina had rarely seen. "What is it?" she asked, setting down the basket of foraged mushrooms she had been sorting. "A message left at the old marker stone," Cale said, holding out the parchment. "Left there for anyone from the region to find. News travels slowly out here, but it travels." Serafina took the parchment and unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the hurried handwriting. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, and when she did, something cold settled in her stomach. The message spoke of unrest within Blackthorn Pack. Whispers of discontent among the pack members. Discontent aimed squarely at their alpha and the human woman he had chosen to stand beside him. The parchment mentioned strange incidents, disputes among pack members that had once been rare, a growing sense that something within the pack's foundation had cracked the night Damon rejected his fated Luna in front of the entire hall. "They are struggling," Serafina said quietly, reading the words again, to be certain she had understood correctly. "It happens," Cale said, watching her carefully, "when an alpha breaks a fated bond without proper cause. The pack feels it, even if they do not always understand why. A bond is not simply a matter between two individuals. It ties into the strength of the pack itself, in ways most wolves never have to think about, because most alphas never break one so carelessly." Serafina folded the parchment slowly, her mind turning over the information, searching for some feeling she expected to find and did not. Not the satisfaction of vindication, not even simple curiosity about what was happening in the place that had once been her whole world. Instead, she felt something closer to distance, as though she were reading news about strangers, rather than about the pack that had raised her, and then discarded her within the same breath. "Does it trouble you?" Cale asked, hearing this. Serafina considered the question honestly before answering. "No," she said finally, and found the word true as she spoke it. "It does not trouble me. It simply confirms what I already suspected, that the bond was never mine to lose. It was something we both needed, and he broke it anyway, and now the consequences are his to carry, not mine." Something in Cale's expression eased at her answer, though she could not have said exactly what he had been watching for. "You have grown," he said quietly, "since the night I found you in the woods." "I have had good reason to," Serafina said, and found herself smiling, small but genuine, the first real smile she had offered in longer than she could remember. "And good company, while I did it." The weeks continued to pass, each one easier than the last, and Serafina found herself, more and more often, forgetting the ache that had once defined every waking hour after the ceremony. She still thought of Blackthorn sometimes, still wondered occasionally about the people she had left behind, the elder Corwin who had tried and failed to speak in her defense, the pack members who had once called her friend before fear silenced them. But the wondering came without pain now, a distant curiosity rather than a wound that needed tending. What occupied her thoughts far more often, in the quiet hours before sleep and the long stretches of companionable silence during the day, was Cale himself, the mystery of him deepening even as her trust in him grew. She noticed the small habits that did not fit the picture of a simple traveler, the way he checked the horizon each morning with the same careful attention a sentry might give a watchtower, the way certain phrases slipped from him occasionally, phrases that carried the cadence of formal pack law rather than casual speech, the way his eyes sometimes settled on her, with an intensity that felt like recognition, as though he were measuring her against some standard she did not yet understand. One night, as a storm rolled through and confined them both to the shelter, the fire burning low against the sound of rain hammering the roof, Serafina found herself studying him across the small space between them, bold enough now, after weeks together, to ask the question she had been holding back. "Cale," she said quietly, "who are you, really?" He looked up from the knife he had been sharpening, and for a long moment, the only sound was the rain and the crackle of the dying fire. She thought, as she often did, that he would deflect again, offer some careful half-answer that revealed nothing. Instead, he set the knife aside, and something in his posture shifted, as though he had finally decided the time for careful evasions had passed. "There are things about me," he said slowly, "that I have kept from you. Not out of distrust, out of caution. The world beyond this shelter is not always kind to those who carry the kind of reputation I carry." "What kind of reputation?" Serafina asked, leaning forward slightly, her heart beginning to beat faster, though she could not have said whether it was fear or anticipation driving the sudden rhythm. Cale held her gaze steadily, gray eyes catching the low firelight. "There will be a time to explain fully," he said. "Soon. I promise you that. But not tonight. Tonight, I only want you to know that whatever you learn about me eventually, it will not change what has happened between us these past weeks. That much, I can promise you without hesitation." Serafina studied him for a long moment, weighing the caution in his words against the sincerity in his eyes, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed him completely. Whatever truth he was protecting, whatever reputation lingered beyond the borders of this small hillside shelter, she trusted, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that it would not diminish the man who had pulled her from the forest floor and asked for nothing but her honesty in return. "Then I will wait," she said simply, "until you are ready." Outside, the storm continued to rage against the shelter walls, but inside, something steady and unshaken had settled between them, a foundation neither the broken bond nor the mystery, still unspoken between them, could fully unsettle. Serafina did not know, not yet, how soon that promised truth would come, or how completely it would change the course of everything that followed. She only knew, as she finally drifted toward sleep with the storm still howling outside, that for the first time since the night Damon Voss had cast her aside in front of everyone she had once called family, she felt something that resembled hope. The storm passed by morning, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. Serafina woke to find Cale already outside, standing at the edge of the clearing with his back to her, perfectly still, his attention fixed on something in the distance. She dressed quickly and stepped out to join him, following his gaze toward the tree line, where nothing appeared out of the ordinary, only wet leaves and morning mist curling low along the ground. "What is it?" she asked. "Someone crossed the border overnight," Cale said. "During the storm." Serafina scanned the tree line again, seeing nothing, though she trusted his senses far more than her own, after weeks of watching him read the forest, like a language she had never learned to speak. "A scout? Like before?" "No," Cale said. "This scent is different, older, more deliberate." He moved without further explanation, striding toward the tree line with a purpose that told her arguing would accomplish nothing. Serafina hurried after him, catching up just as he knelt near a cluster of disturbed leaves at the base of an old oak, studying the ground with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered. "Footprints," he said, tracing the shape in the mud with 2 fingers, careful not to disturb it further. Heavy stride. Moving with purpose, not caution. Whoever this was did not fear being tracked. "That does not sound reassuring," Serafina said. "It is not," Cale agreed, straightening and continuing to follow the trail deeper into the trees, his movements sharper now, more alert than she had seen him since the night of the scouts. They followed the tracks for nearly a mile, winding through unfamiliar terrain that grew steadily more rugged, the trees thinning as the ground rose toward a rocky outcropping overlooking a shallow ravine. Cale slowed as they approached the rise, motioning for Serafina to stay low and quiet, and together, they crested the ridge carefully, staying hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Below them, in the ravine, stood a lone figure, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark travel clothes marked with a crest Serafina did not recognize, a silver emblem stitched into the shoulder of his cloak. He stood with the stillness of someone waiting, his head tilted slightly, as though listening for something beyond the ordinary sounds of the forest. "Do you know him?" Serafina whispered. Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know the crest," he said quietly. "Ashgrove territory, southeast of here." "Why would someone from Ashgrove cross into neutral land during a storm?" "That," Cale said, "is what I intend to find out." Before Serafina could object, Cale rose from behind the boulders and began making his way down toward the ravine, his approach deliberately unhurried, his hands loose and visible at his sides, in a gesture she recognized, even without pack training, as a signal of controlled intent rather than aggression. The stranger below turned at the sound of his approach, and Serafina watched, heart hammering, as the man's expression shifted the moment his eyes settled on Kale, surprise giving way almost instantly to something that looked remarkably like alarm. "I did not expect to find anyone out here," the stranger said, his voice carrying up toward where Serafina still crouched behind the boulders, straining to hear every word. "This land is unclaimed. I meant no trespass." "You are well within Ashgrove borders 3 miles east of here," Kale said, his tone even, but carrying an unmistakable weight, the same quiet authority Serafina had noticed before, but never heard directed at anyone but herself. "There was no need to cross this far north, unless you had a reason." The stranger hesitated, glancing between Kale and the tree line, as though calculating the wisdom of continuing this conversation at all. "I was sent to confirm a rumor," he said finally, choosing his words with visible care. "Nothing more." "What rumor?" "That the feared one has taken up residence again, after all these years of silence." My Alpha wished to know if the stories were true. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. The feared one. She had heard fragments of that title before, whispered occasionally among pack elders when she was younger, always in tones of caution rather than curiosity, the kind of name spoken carefully, as though saying it too loudly might summon whatever it described. She had never connected it to anything real, had assumed it belonged to old stories meant to frighten young pups into obedience, the way every pack seemed to carry its own version of a shadow figure lurking at the edges of civilized territory. Kale's expression did not change, though something in his posture shifted, a stillness settling over him that felt entirely different from his usual calm, heavier somehow, more deliberate. "Tell your Alpha," he said slowly, "that whatever he heard, it changes nothing about the borders of this land. Neutral ground remains neutral. Ashgrove would do well to remember that, and to keep its scouts on the correct side of the marker stones." The stranger's throat worked visibly as he swallowed, and he took a careful step back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of retreat rather than defiance. "I will deliver the message," he said. "There will be no further trespass. You have my word." "See that there is not," Kale said, and something in the flat finality of his tone sent the stranger turning and disappearing into the trees, at a pace that bordered on undignified haste, all pretense of calm confidence abandoned, the moment he judged himself free to run. Serafina remained crouched behind the boulders long after the stranger's footsteps had faded into silence, her mind racing through everything she had just witnessed, every half-formed suspicion she had carried these past weeks suddenly crystallizing into something she could no longer dismiss as imagination. Kale climbed back up the ridge toward her, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the tension still lingering in the set of his shoulders. "The feared one," she said, before he had even reached her side. "That is what he called you." Kale did not answer immediately. He settled onto a flat stone near where she crouched, resting his forearms on his knees, and for a long moment simply looked out over the ravine below, as though weighing how much of the truth he was finally ready to release. "It is a name I earned a long time ago," he said finally. "Not one I chose for myself." "Earned how?" "There was a war," Kale said, his voice dropping lower, carrying a weight Serafina had not heard from him before, not even in his rare moments of openness during the quiet evenings by the fire. "Between territories, many years ago, before you were likely old enough to understand what was happening beyond your own pack's borders, I fought in it. I ended it, eventually, in ways that left an impression on every pack that witnessed what I was capable of when pushed far enough." Serafina studied him carefully, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, careful man who had nursed her back to health with the picture now forming in her mind. A man whose reputation alone could send a grown scout running in fear. A man whose name, even years removed from whatever war he was describing, still carried enough weight to make an entire pack send scouts simply to confirm rumors of his presence. "That is why you live out here," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, because you chose to leave it all behind. Power like that does not bring peace," Kale said quietly. "It only brings more people wanting something from you, more packs hoping to use your strength for their own ambitions, more enemies hoping to see you fall. I grew tired of being a weapon other people wanted to point in whatever direction served them best. So I left. I chose this instead. Quiet, simple, mine. And now I have disrupted that. Serafina said softly, a note of guilt creeping into her voice as she considered the scout, the crest, the careful confrontation she had just witnessed. My being here has drawn attention back toward you. No, Cale said, and the certainty in his voice was immediate, leaving no room for her guilt to take root. You have not disrupted anything I did not already choose, the moment I decided to help you instead of walking past. If word spreads that I remain in this region, that is a consequence I accept willingly, because the alternative would have meant leaving you to die alone in these woods, and that was never a choice I was capable of making. Serafina felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, entirely separate from the lingering shock of everything she had just learned. She had spent weeks slowly rebuilding trust in another living being after Damon's betrayal had taught her how easily trust could be weaponized against her, and here, finally, stood a man whose power could reshape entire territories with a word, who had chosen instead to spend that power quietly protecting a stranger who had nothing to offer him in return. Thank you, she said, for telling me. There is more, Cale said, rising from the stone and offering her his hand to help her up. More you deserve to know, when the time is right, but it will keep a little longer. For now, we should return before that scout decides his courage has returned enough to send others looking for confirmation of his own. Serafina took his offered hand, and as their fingers closed together, she felt something pass between them that was entirely different from anything she had shared with Damon, even in the earliest days of their bond. Something built not from fate or obligation, but from choice, freely given and freely returned. They walked back toward the shelter together, in comfortable silence, and though the mystery of exactly who Cale truly was had only deepened rather than resolved, Serafina found she no longer feared whatever truth still waited to be revealed. Whatever title he carried beyond these quiet woods, whatever power made grown scouts flee at the mere confirmation of his presence, the man walking beside her remained, in every way that mattered, the same quiet and steady presence who had pulled her from the forest floor and asked for nothing but her trust in return. That trust, she realized as they reached the shelter and settled back into the familiar rhythm of their shared days, had already grown into something far deeper than she had allowed herself to name. And somewhere beyond the borders of this quiet, unclaimed land, word was already beginning to spread, carried by a frightened scout back to his alpha, that the feared one had returned, and that he was no longer alone. The old woman arrived at the edge of the clearing without warning, leaning heavily on a carved wooden staff, her white hair loose around a face lined with more years than Serafina could easily count. Cale was on his feet before Serafina even registered the sound of footsteps, moving between her and the stranger, with the same protective instinct he had shown the morning of the scout, though something in his posture this time carried recognition rather than suspicion. Mira, he said, and the single word carried an unmistakable warmth, rare enough from him that Serafina found herself studying the exchange closely. I heard rumors that you had returned to this stretch of land, the old woman said, her voice raspy but strong, her sharp eyes moving past Cale to settle on Serafina with obvious interest. I did not expect to find you keeping company. This is Serafina, Cale said. She has been staying with me these past weeks. Mira studied Serafina for a long moment, her gaze carrying a weight that made Serafina feel as though the old woman could see straight through to whatever truth lay beneath her carefully composed exterior. The rejected Luna, Mira said finally, and Serafina stiffened at the words, unprepared to hear her old title spoken so plainly by a stranger. You know of me? Word travels, even to old healers who keep to themselves, Mira said, not unkindly. Blackthorn's shame has become common conversation among the packs of this region. An alpha who rejects his fated mate for a human girl, in front of his entire pack, is not the kind of story that stays quiet for long. Serafina felt heat rise in her cheeks, an old and familiar shame threatening to resurface, but Cale's hand found her shoulder briefly, steady and grounding, and the shame receded before it could take hold. It is not a story I am ashamed of, Serafina said, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. The shame belongs to him, not to me. Something like approval flickered across Mira's weathered face. Good, she said simply. That is the correct way to carry it. She turned her attention back to Cale, and her expression shifted, growing more serious. I did not come merely to satisfy curiosity. There is news you should hear, and I judged it best delivered in person rather than left at a marker stone for anyone to find. Kale's posture straightened, the warmth of a moment before replaced by careful attention. Go on. The Southern Council has called a gathering, Mira said. In 3 weeks' time, at the Neutral Hall near Ravenswood Territory. Every pack within 100 miles has been summoned, alphas and their chosen delegations both. There are disputes to settle, border matters, trade agreements, the usual business of packs who cannot manage their own affairs without an audience to witness the settling of scores. That is not unusual, Kale said. The council gathers every few years for such matters. No, Mira agreed, but this time, your name has been raised. Several packs have petitioned the council to formally invite you, to seek your counsel on matters of border security, given the unrest that has spread through this region since the war ended. They wish to know if the Feared One intends to remain settled here, and if so, what that might mean for the balance of power among the surrounding territories. Serafina watched Kale's jaw tighten, a flicker of old weariness passing behind his gray eyes, before he mastered it, smoothing his expression back into careful neutrality. I have no interest in council politics, he said. I made that clear enough years ago, when I walked away from it entirely. They know that, Mira said, and yet they have asked regardless. Reputation does not fade simply because a man wishes it would, Kale, especially not one earned the way yours was earned. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Serafina, before returning to him. And there is more. Blackthorn Pack has also been summoned, along with every other pack in the region. Damon Voss will be present, along with his human companion, if the rumors of his continued devotion to her prove accurate. The name landed in the clearing like a stone dropped into still water, and Serafina felt her heart stutter, an old and complicated tangle of emotions rising too quickly for her to sort through cleanly. Fear, though fainter than she expected. Something that might have been curiosity, and beneath both, something steadier. A strength she had not possessed the night of the ceremony, built slowly over the weeks spent healing in this quiet corner of unclaimed land. I have no reason to attend such a gathering, Serafina said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt their hollowness, some instinct already telling her that the universe rarely arranged such convenient coincidences without purpose. Perhaps not, Mira said, but I suspect the choice may not remain entirely yours. Word of a rejected Luna finding shelter with the Feared One has already begun to spread, faster than either of you may realize. Should you fail to attend, the rumors will only grow louder in your absence, shaped by whoever chooses to tell the story instead of you. Kale's expression darkened further at this, and Serafina understood, watching him, that whatever careful peace he had built for himself out here in these quiet woods was now under genuine threat. Threads of his old life, pulling him back toward a world he had deliberately left behind. Thank you for the warning, Mira, Kale said finally. We will consider what to do. The old healer nodded, satisfied, and after sharing a simple meal with them and exchanging a few final words with Kale, in a low voice, Serafina could not fully hear. She departed as unexpectedly as she had arrived, disappearing back into the trees, with the same steady, unhurried pace that suggested decades of walking these particular woods. That evening, as the fire burned low and the forest settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Serafina found Kale more withdrawn than she had seen him in weeks, his gaze fixed on the flames, his thoughts clearly turned inward, toward whatever weight the day's news had settled onto his shoulders. You do not want to attend this gathering, she said, breaking the silence gently. No, Kale admitted. I have spent years building distance between myself and the politics of the packs. Every gathering, every council session, every plea for counsel, drags me a little further back, toward a life I chose to leave behind for good reason. Then do not go, Serafina said simply. Kale looked up at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. It is not that simple anymore, he said. Not with your name now tied to mine, in whatever rumors are spreading through these territories. If we do not attend, others will decide the story for us, and I have learned, through hard experience, that stories decided by others rarely favor the truth. Serafina considered this, turning the problem over carefully in her mind. She thought of Damon, of the possibility of standing in the same hall as him again, of facing the pack that had watched her humiliation without a single voice raised in her defense. The thought no longer carried the same sharp terror it might have weeks earlier, back when the bond's absence still felt like an open wound rather than a healed scar. But it carried weight regardless. the weight of unfinished business, of a story that had ended badly, and now demanded, perhaps, some kind of continuation. "If we go," she said slowly, "what would it mean? For you, and for whatever peace you have built out here? It would mean the world learning that the feared one has chosen to remain settled in this region," Kale said. "It would mean renewed attention from every pack hoping to secure my favor, or fearing my potential opposition. It would mean the quiet I have guarded so carefully, becoming harder to protect. Then why would you even consider it?" Kale was quiet for a long moment before answering, his gaze returning to the fire, though Serafina sensed his attention remained fully on her, weighing something before he spoke. "Because," he said finally, "I find that the peace I have built out here, quiet as it has been, means less to me now than it did before you arrived. And I find that I am no longer willing to let others decide your story for you, the way they were allowed to decide it once already." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but unmistakably significant, and Serafina felt her breath catch at the weight behind them. She had spent weeks slowly falling into something with this man that she had not allowed herself to name directly. Some careful and growing warmth she had told herself was simply gratitude, simply the natural closeness born of shared solitude and mutual trust. But sitting here now, watching firelight play across his scarred face, as he spoke of refusing to let others decide her story again, she understood, with sudden clarity, that gratitude alone could not account for the way her heart had begun to respond to his presence. "Kale," she said softly. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling quietly between them, the forest holding its breath around the small clearing that had become, somewhere in the past weeks, something closer to home than Blackthorn's great hall had ever managed to feel. "I am not asking you to feel obligated toward me," Kale said carefully, "because of what I have shared, or because of what I may have implied. Whatever gatherers awaits us, whatever truths come to light there, my protection of you does not depend on anything beyond your own wishes." "I know that," Serafina said. "I have known that since the night you found me. You have never once asked anything of me in exchange for your kindness." "Then know this as well," Kale said, his voice low but steady, carrying none of the careful guardedness she had grown accustomed to over these weeks. "Whatever grows between us, I would rather it grow freely, without the shadow of what happened to you at Blackthorn hanging over it. You deserve a choice made from strength, not from the wreckage of a broken bond." Serafina felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from something warmer and harder to name, a feeling of being truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her life, by someone who asked nothing of her except honesty. "I have made my choice already," she said quietly. "It was made somewhere in these past weeks, without me even fully realizing it was happening." Kale's expression shifted, something careful and hopeful breaking through the guarded composure he wore so consistently, and for a moment, the space between them felt charged with a possibility neither of them had dared name aloud until now. But before either could speak further, a low howl echoed faintly in the distance, carried on the night wind from somewhere beyond the ridge, and both of them stilled instinctively, old instincts overriding the moment's tenderness. "Another scout?" Serafina asked quietly. Kale listened carefully for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he said. "That call belongs to no pack. It is a signal, used by messengers who travel between territories on council business. Someone is delivering word to the surrounding packs about the gathering." "Which means the choice may already be made for us," Serafina said, understanding the implication immediately. "It seems that way," Kale agreed, though something in his voice now carried a different quality than the reluctance of before, something closer to resolve. "Then we will attend, and we will face whatever awaits us there together, on our own terms, rather than allowing rumor and distance to shape the story before we arrive to tell it ourselves." Over the following days, as the date of the gathering drew steadily closer, Serafina found herself preparing in ways both practical and internal. She practiced with the knife Kale had begun teaching her to use properly, her movements growing steadier and more confident with each session. She mended and prepared what few clothes she owned, understanding that whatever impression she made at the gathering would carry weight far beyond simple appearance, given the story already spreading ahead of her arrival. And in the quiet hours before sleep, she found herself rehearsing, again and again, the composure she would need to carry into a hall that might well include Damon Voss among its gathered alphas. Kale, for his part, grew more thoughtful as the days passed, often disappearing for hours at a time on solitary walks through the surrounding woods, returning each time with the same careful, unreadable expression, offering no explanation beyond assurances that he was simply thinking through what needed to be said, and to whom, once they arrived at the neutral hall. 3 nights before they were due to depart, Serafina woke in the deep hours before dawn to find Kale sitting outside the shelter, staring up at a sky thick with stars, his posture unusually still even for a man who valued stillness as much as he did. She joined him quietly, settling beside him without a word, and for a long while they simply sat together in the cold night air, watching the stars turn slowly overhead. "Are you afraid?" she asked finally. "Not for myself," Kale said. "I have faced far worse than a council gathering and its accompanying politics. I am thinking of what awaits you there, facing him again, in front of everyone who once witnessed your humiliation." Serafina considered this honestly, searching within herself for the fear she expected to find, and discovering, to her own quiet surprise, that it had shrunk considerably in the weeks since the ceremony, replaced by something steadier, something that felt, increasingly, like readiness rather than dread. "I am not the same woman who stood on that platform," she said finally. "Whatever awaits me there, I will not face it as someone waiting to be rejected again. I will face it as someone who has already survived the worst he could offer, and found something better waiting on the other side of it." Kale turned to look at her then, something fierce and proud moving behind his gray eyes, and though he said nothing further, the way his hand found hers in the darkness, steady and warm, spoke more clearly than any words could have managed. They sat together beneath the vast spread of stars until the sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn, both of them quietly steeling themselves for whatever awaited them at the gathering that would, in ways neither of them could yet fully anticipate, change the course of everything that followed. They set out for Ravenswood territory 2 days later, traveling light, carrying only what they could comfortably manage on foot, across the several days' journey ahead. Serafina had never traveled this far from Blackthorn land in her life, and despite the uncertainty waiting at the end of the road, she found herself drawn in spite of everything, to the changing landscape around them, the way the dense northern forest gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, the way the air itself seemed to grow lighter the further they moved from the borders that had once defined the whole of her world. Kale moved through the unfamiliar territory with the same quiet confidence he carried everywhere, clearly no stranger to these roads despite the years he claimed to have spent in deliberate isolation. He pointed out landmarks as they passed, an old stone bridge that marked the boundary between 2 minor territories, a cluster of ancient trees said to predate every pack currently claiming the surrounding land, small pieces of history he offered without prompting, as though sharing them helped steady his own nerves as much as it entertained her. On the 3rd day of travel, as they made camp beside a narrow river, a group of merchants passed along the road nearby, their wagon loaded with goods bound, they explained when Kale hailed them for news, for the very gathering Serafina and Kale were traveling toward. The lead merchant, a stout man with a graying beard and shrewd eyes, studied Kale for a long moment, before his expression shifted into something like recognition, quickly masked behind practiced neutrality. "You are headed to Ravenswood as well," the merchant said, more statement than question. "We are," Kale confirmed. "Then perhaps you have heard the talk already," the merchant continued, glancing briefly at Serafina, before returning his attention to Kale. "About the rejected Luna of Blackthorn, and the man who is said to be sheltering her. Quite the story, traveling ahead of the gathering itself. Some say the feared one has finally found reason to step back into the world." Serafina felt her pulse quicken at hearing the rumor spoken so plainly by a stranger, confirmation that Mira's warning had been entirely accurate, that their arrival at the gathering would carry weight and attention neither of them could easily control. Kale's expression remained carefully neutral, though Serafina had learned by now to read the small tells beneath his composure, the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw that betrayed more tension than his voice revealed. "Stories tend to grow larger with each retelling," Kale said evenly. "I would not put too much faith in what merchants carry along with their goods." The merchant chuckled, though something knowing remained in his eyes. "Perhaps," he said. "Though I will say, having heard the description given by those who claim to have seen you both, I do not think the story requires much exaggeration. His gaze flicked once more to Serafina, this time carrying something closer to genuine curiosity than idle gossip. The pack that let you go was foolish indeed, if even half of what is said proves true. Serafina did not know how to respond to such a direct statement from a stranger, and so she simply offered a small, careful nod, grateful, when the merchant, sensing perhaps that he had pressed the conversation as far as courtesy allowed, tipped his hat and continued on with his wagon, leaving Kale and Serafina alone once more beside the quiet river. "This is what Mira warned us about," Serafina said, once the merchant's wagon had disappeared around a bend in the road. "The story is already ahead of us." "It seems so," Kale agreed, though something in his tone suggested he had expected as much, had perhaps even prepared himself for exactly this kind of encounter during the long walks he had taken alone, in the days before their departure. "It changes little about our purpose in attending. If anything, it confirms the wisdom of arriving, to tell our own truth, rather than allowing rumor to shape it further in our absence." They continued their journey the following morning, and as the days passed, the signs of their approaching destination grew steadily more apparent, the road widening, the traffic increasing, small clusters of travelers from various territories, converging along the same route, all bound for the same gathering, all carrying, in one form or another, some version of the story that had apparently begun spreading faster than either Serafina or Kale had anticipated. On the fifth evening, as they made camp within sight of the distant lights that marked the outer edge of Ravenswood territory, a different kind of encounter interrupted the quiet of their meal. 3 riders approached along the road, their pace unhurried but their posture alert, and as they drew closer, Serafina recognized, with a jolt of unexpected tension, the deep green cloaks marking them as Blackthorn scouts, sent ahead, most likely, to assess the road before their own Alpha's delegation arrived. The lead rider slowed as he caught sight of the small camp, his eyes widening slightly with recognition the moment they settled on Serafina's face. She recognized him too, a young scout named Fenwick who had trained alongside her years earlier, back when she had still believed her future belonged entirely to Blackthorn Pack. "Serafina," Fenwick said, his voice carrying equal parts surprise and something that might have been relief. "We heard you were alive. I did not fully believe it until now." "I am alive," Serafina confirmed, keeping her voice steady, aware of Kale's watchful presence beside her, close, but not crowding, ready to intervene should the encounter turn hostile, though nothing in Fenwick's demeanor suggested any such intention. "The pack has not been the same since you left," Fenwick continued, his gaze flicking briefly toward Kale before returning to Serafina, curiosity plain in his expression. Whispers mostly. Discontent among the older members. Some blame the Alpha's choice. Others blame the human woman he brought in to replace you. He hesitated, then added, more quietly, "For what it is worth, I never believed you deserved what happened that night. None of us who cared for you believed it. We simply lacked the courage to say so at the time." Something in Serafina's chest eased slightly at the admission, an old wound that had never fully closed finding, unexpectedly, a small measure of acknowledgement it had not realized it still needed. "Thank you for saying that now," she said, "even if it comes later than I once needed to hear it." Fenwick nodded, something apologetic in the gesture, before straightening in his saddle and glancing once more toward Kale, his expression shifting into something more cautious, more formally respectful. "You are traveling with the one they call the Feared One," he said, not quite a question, though clearly seeking confirmation. "I am Kale," Kale said simply, offering nothing further, though the weight of his gaze held steady on the young scout, calm, but unmistakably watchful. "We mean no trouble," Fenwick said quickly, some old instinct clearly urging caution in the face of a name that carried such heavy reputation. "We were only sent ahead to assess the road before the Alpha's party arrives tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Serafina repeated, absorbing the timing, understanding that whatever confrontation awaited her at the gathering hall would come far sooner than she had prepared herself to expect. "Yes," Fenwick confirmed. "The Alpha and his delegation are traveling just half a day behind us." He hesitated again, something uncertain crossing his features, before he spoke his next words carefully. "He does not know you will be there." "I do not believe anyone has told him yet," Serafina absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind, weighing what it might mean for the confrontation now looming so much closer than she had anticipated. Somewhere behind her composed exterior, old fear stirred faintly, the memory of standing on that platform in her pale blue dress, waiting for words that never came, replaced instead by public humiliation, delivered in front of everyone she had once called family. But beneath that old fear, something steadier remained, the quiet strength she had rebuilt over these past weeks, tempered by Cale's steady presence beside her, and by her own hard-won understanding that whatever happened next, she would not face it as the same broken woman who had walked away from Blackthorn's great hall all those weeks ago. "Then he will learn soon enough," Serafina said, and found her voice remarkably steady as she spoke the words. "And this time, I will not be the only one standing in that hall who commands respect." Fenwick studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his features, before he offered a final respectful nod and turned his horse back toward the road, his companions following close behind, all three riders disappearing into the gathering dusk, carrying with them, Serafina suspected, news of this encounter that would reach Blackthorn's delegation well before their own arrival at the gathering hall. That night, sleep came slowly for Serafina, her mind turning over every possible version of the confrontation that awaited her, rehearsing responses to accusations that had not yet been spoken, steadying herself against a fear that, despite everything, still lingered somewhere beneath her hard-won composure. Cale remained close throughout the night, his presence a quiet anchor against the storm of anticipation building within her, and though neither of them spoke much as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, the silence between them carried its own kind of comfort, a shared understanding that whatever awaited them at Ravenswood, they would face it together, on terms they had chosen for themselves, rather than terms dictated by rumor or fear. By the time dawn broke over the final stretch of road leading toward the neutral hall, Serafina had made her peace, as much as anyone could, with whatever confrontation the coming hours might hold. She rose with the sun, dressed carefully in the simple but well-kept clothes she had prepared for this moment, and stood for a long while at the edge of their final camp, looking out over the distant rooftops of Ravenswood territory just visible beyond the tree line, gathering her strength for the walk that would carry her, finally, back into a world that had once cast her aside without a second thought, and that was about to learn, in ways it could not yet anticipate, precisely how much that world had underestimated her. Damon Voss stood at the window of his private chamber, watching rain streak down the glass, and tried to remember the last time he had slept through an entire night, without waking, in the deep hours before dawn, his chest aching with a hollowness he could not explain to anyone, least of all himself. 6 weeks had passed since the ceremony. 6 weeks since he had stood on that platform and spoken words he had told himself, at the time, were necessary, were honest, were the only path toward the life he believed he wanted. He had expected relief. He had expected, once the bond was broken and Serafina was gone from Packlands, that the strange restlessness that had been building in him for months would finally settle, that he would wake each morning beside Elise and feel the certainty he had convinced himself was waiting for him on the other side of that difficult decision. Instead, he woke each morning feeling as though something vital had been carved out of his chest and never properly replaced. Behind him, the door opened without a knock, and Elise swept into the room, her expression already tightening into the particular kind of irritation that had become so familiar these past weeks that Damon sometimes wondered if he could recall what her face looked like when it was not shaped by some complaint or demand. "The kitchen staff are refusing to prepare the meal I requested," she said, without preamble. "Something about supplies being reserved for pack stores. You need to speak with them." "There is a shortage this season," Damon said, not turning from the window. "The stores are reserved for a reason. Everyone in the pack is managing with less right now, Elise. Not only the kitchen staff." "I am not everyone in the pack," Elise said, an edge creeping into her voice. "I should not be expected to eat the same simple fare as common wolves who have never known anything better." Damon closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weariness settle over him at her words, a weariness that had grown steadily heavier with each passing week since the ceremony. He had once found Elise's confidence alluring, her sharp certainty about what she wanted and how the world ought to accommodate her, a refreshing contrast to what he had told himself, in the months leading up to the rejection, was Serafina's quiet, unassuming steadiness. He had mistaken confidence for strength, he was beginning to understand, and steadiness for weakness, and the realization sat like a stone in his stomach every time Elise opened her mouth to demand something new. "I will speak with the kitchen staff," he said finally, if only to end the conversation. "But I will not ask them to give you more than any other pack member currently receives. The shortage affects everyone equally. That is how it must be, if the pack is to weather it without resentment building against us." Elise's eyes narrowed, though she said nothing further on the matter, turning instead toward the door with a huff of frustration that had become so routine Damon barely registered it anymore. "You have grown cold," she said, pausing at the threshold, "since the ceremony. I hardly recognize the man who once promised me the world." Damon did not answer immediately, and something in his silence seemed to satisfy her more than any words could have, because she left without waiting for a response, the door closing behind her with a firmness that fell just short of a slam. Alone again, Damon returned his attention to the window, to the rain still streaking down in silver lines against the gray afternoon light, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, to sit with the thought he had been avoiding since the night of the ceremony. He had made a mistake, not simply in choosing Elise, though that mistake had revealed itself steadily over these past weeks, layer by layer, as her true nature emerged from beneath the careful charm she had shown him during their courtship. The deeper mistake, the one that kept him awake through the long hours before dawn, was in how he had handled Serafina, the cruelty of a public rejection when a private conversation would have caused far less damage, the callousness of casting her out with nothing when years of partnership, even a partnership built on obligation, rather than choice, should have earned her better. He had told himself, in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, that the bond itself was the problem, that fate had simply chosen wrong, that his restlessness and dissatisfaction stemmed from being tied to someone who did not truly excite him the way Elise seemed to. He understood now, with the clarity that only distance and consequence could provide, that he had confused excitement with worthiness, had mistaken the thrill of something forbidden and new for something deeper and more lasting. Serafina had never demanded anything of him beyond basic respect. She had supported pack members quietly, had trained alongside warriors without complaint, had carried herself with a steadiness he had, in his youthful restlessness, mistaken for dullness rather than recognizing it for the genuine strength it actually represented. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Corwin, the pack elder who had tried and failed to speak in Serafina's defense the night of the ceremony, entered at his call, his expression grave in a way that immediately put Damon on alert. "What is it?" Damon asked. "Word has reached us from travelers passing through," Corwin said carefully, choosing his words with the deliberate caution of someone long practiced in delivering difficult news to volatile alphas. "Serafina is alive. She has been seen, more than once now, in the company of a man. The surrounding territories have begun calling the Feared One." Damon felt something cold settle in his chest at the name, a title he had heard whispered occasionally among older pack members, always in tones that suggested a legend rather than a living threat, a story from the war years that predated his own leadership by a generation. "The Feared One," he repeated slowly. "That is a title from the old wars. Surely you do not mean the same figure." "I mean exactly that figure," Corwin said. "The rumors are consistent enough now, from enough independent sources, that I believe them to be accurate. Serafina has been under his protection for weeks, and there is more." He hesitated, watching Damon's face carefully before continuing. "The Southern Council has called a gathering at Ravenswood in 3 weeks' time. Word suggests both of them will attend." Damon absorbed this information slowly, feeling the careful composure he had maintained through the difficult weeks since the ceremony beginning to crack under the weight of it. Serafina, alive and protected by a figure whose reputation alone had once been enough to end an entire war. Serafina, who he had cast aside as weak and unremarkable, apparently deemed worthy of protection by one of the most powerful and feared wolves in the region's history. "Does the pack know of this?" Damon asked. "Whispers have already begun," Corwin admitted. "You cannot expect news of this magnitude to remain contained, not when merchants and travelers carry it along every road between here and Ravenswood." Damon turned back to the window, his mind racing through implications he had not fully considered until this moment. He had assumed, in the weeks since the ceremony, that Serafina had simply disappeared, that she had found some quiet corner of the world to rebuild whatever life remained to her, far from Blackthorn's reach and, he had told himself, far from his concern. He had not imagined her thriving. He had certainly not imagined her under the protection of a figure whose name alone could apparently make grown scouts retreat without a fight. "I need to think," Damon said finally. Corwin nodded and withdrew, leaving Damon alone once more, with the rain and his own increasingly turbulent thoughts. He found himself, unbidden, reaching for the place in his chest where the bond had once lived, an old habit he had thought long broken since the night he severed it deliberately, cruelly, in front of the entire pack. The absence there felt different now than it had in the immediate aftermath of the rejection. Then, it had felt like relief, like a weight finally lifted. Now, weeks later, with Elise's demanding presence grating against nerves already worn thin by the responsibilities of leadership and the quiet unraveling of a pack that no longer trusted its alpha's judgment, the absence felt instead like a hollow ache, a phantom limb reminding him constantly of something he had chosen, foolishly, to cut away. Over the following days, the whispers Corwin had warned him about grew steadily louder, impossible to contain within the private chambers of pack leadership. Members of the pack, gathering in the training yards and the communal halls, spoke openly now of the strange discontent that had settled over Blackthorn since the rejection, disputes flaring between wolves who had once managed their disagreements with ease, a general sense of unease that seemed to seep into every corner of daily pack life. Damon heard the murmurs even when they were not intended for his ears, caught fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly whenever he entered a room, and understood, with growing dread, that his pack's faith in his leadership had begun to erode, in ways that mirrored the erosion of his own certainty about the choices he had made. Elise, for her part, seemed entirely unaware of the shifting currents around her, or perhaps simply unwilling to acknowledge them, continuing to make demands of the kitchen staff and the household attendants, with the same entitled confidence she had shown since her arrival, growing increasingly impatient whenever Damon failed to intervene on her behalf with the swiftness she believed her position warranted. "You seem distracted," she said one evening, as they sat together in the private dining hall, a meal neither of them had touched growing cold between them. "Is something troubling you?" Damon considered how to answer, weighing the wisdom of sharing his growing unease against the near certainty that Elise would offer little comfort, little understanding of the weight now pressing down on him from every direction. "There is a gathering at Ravenswood," he said finally, choosing the simplest version of the truth. "In a few weeks, we will be expected to attend." "A gathering of packs," Elise said, her expression brightening with an interest that felt, to Damon's increasingly weary ear, more focused on the social opportunity than any genuine concern for pack business. "That sounds like a fine chance to be seen properly, as your chosen companion, rather than hiding away here, while your pack whispers about me behind closed doors." Something in her words landed wrong, a careless dismissal of the very real tension building throughout the pack, and Damon found himself studying her across the table with an clarity he had been avoiding for weeks, seeing, perhaps fully for the first time, how little genuine concern she carried for anything beyond her own comfort and standing. "Serafina will be there as well," Damon said, watching her reaction carefully. Elise's expression flickered, something sharp and calculating passing behind her eyes, before she smoothed it back into careless indifference. "The rejected Luna," she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. "What of it? She holds no power here any longer. Whatever pity gathering she has found for herself changes nothing about our position." "She is under the protection of the feared one," Damon said, and watched, this time, as genuine alarm finally broke through Elise's careful composure, her eyes widening slightly before she caught herself. "That is merely a story," she said, though something uncertain had crept into her voice now. "A legend meant to frighten pack children into obedience." "It is not merely a story," Damon said quietly. "I have had confirmation now, from multiple sources. He is real, and Serafina has spent these past weeks under his direct protection." Elise fell silent at this, her fork resting untouched against her plate, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn, Damon saw something that looked genuinely like fear cross her features, quickly masked but unmistakable in the brief moment before she regained her composure. He wondered, not for the first time, what exactly Elise's ambitions had truly been when she first set her sights on him. What calculations had gone into her pursuit of a bonded alpha already promised to another woman, and whether those calculations had accounted for the possibility that the woman she had helped cast aside might find protection powerful enough to threaten everything Elise had worked to secure for herself. "It changes nothing," Elise said finally, though her voice lacked the certainty it usually carried. "You are still alpha here. Whatever protection she has found does not diminish your own standing." Damon did not answer, his thoughts already drifting elsewhere, toward the gathering that now loomed ahead of him like a reckoning he could no longer avoid, toward the woman he had cast aside so carelessly, and the growing certainty, settling heavier in his chest with each passing day, that he had made a mistake whose consequences he was only beginning to understand. That night, long after Elise had retired to her own chamber in a mood he no longer had the energy to soothe, Damon walked alone through the quiet halls of Blackthorn's great house, past the platform where the ceremony had taken place, still faintly marked by the memory of candlelight and silver ribbons, and the sound of his own voice speaking words he could not now take back. He stopped there, in the empty hall, and allowed himself, finally, to remember Serafina as she had actually been, not as the disappointment he had convinced himself she represented in the months before the ceremony, but as she truly was, steady and loyal and quietly strong, in ways he had been too restless and too foolish to properly value. He thought of the way she had faced him that night, refusing to beg, refusing to break down in front of the pack, even as he tore the bond from her, without warning or mercy. He thought of the strength it must have taken to walk away from that platform, with her chin held high, into a world that offered her nothing, no protection, no title, no certainty of survival. And he understood, standing alone in the quiet hall where he had once believed he was choosing freedom, that whatever waited for him at the gathering in Ravenswood, he would have to face it as a man who had thrown away something precious in pursuit of something hollow, and that no amount of regret, however genuine, could fully undo the damage already done. The weeks leading up to the gathering passed in a haze of mounting tension, both within the pack and within Damon himself. Disputes among pack members grew more frequent, requiring his intervention with increasing regularity, each conflict resolved but leaving behind a residue of distrust that seemed to accumulate rather than dissipate. Elise's demands continued unabated, though a new brittleness had entered her manner, a barely concealed anxiety about the gathering ahead that she attempted to mask through even greater displays of confidence and entitlement. Damon found himself, in the final days before their departure for Ravenswood, standing once again at the window of his private chamber, watching the road that would soon carry him toward a reckoning he had spent 6 weeks trying to avoid facing directly. Whatever awaited him there, whatever Serafina had become under the protection of a wolf so powerful that his very name could unsettle entire packs, Damon understood, with a clarity that had been building steadily since Corwin first delivered the news, that the man who arrived at that gathering hall would not be the same certain, careless alpha who had stood on that platform 6 weeks earlier and cast aside the one person who had never once given him reason to doubt her loyalty. 2 days before the delegation was due to depart, an incident occurred in the household kitchens that lodged itself permanently in Damon's memory, though he would not fully understand its significance until much later. He had entered the kitchen corridor searching for Corwin, only to find Elise standing over a young serving girl who knelt on the stone floor, gathering shattered pieces of a porcelain bowl with trembling hands. "You will replace this from your own wages," Elise was saying, her voice sharp with a cruelty Damon had not heard directed so openly at pack staff before. "Careless, clumsy girl. Do you have any idea what that bowl cost?" "I am sorry," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper, not daring to look up from the floor. "It slipped from my hands. I did not mean." "I do not care what you meant," Elise snapped. "Results are what matter. Clean this mess, and consider yourself fortunate I do not have you dismissed entirely." Damon stepped forward, before he had fully decided to intervene, something in the scene before him, striking a nerve he had not expected. "Elise," he said, and she turned, startled, her expression shifting quickly from irritation to careful composure the moment she registered his presence. "Damon," she said, "this girl broke pack property. I was simply addressing the matter." "She will not pay for it from her wages," Damon said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. He knelt beside the young serving girl, helping her gather the remaining pieces of broken porcelain himself, an action that visibly startled both Elise and the girl in equal measure. Accidents happen. No one is dismissed or docked pay for a dropped bowl in this household. The serving girl looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes, murmuring her thanks before hurrying away with the swept pieces, leaving Damon and Elise alone in the corridor. Elise's expression had hardened considerably, though she held her tongue until they were fully alone. "You undermine me in front of the staff," she said, once the girl had disappeared. "How am I to command any respect in this household if you contradict me at every turn?" "Respect is not commanded through cruelty," Damon said, and something in the flatness of his own voice surprised him, the words emerging with a certainty he had not planned but recognized, once spoken, as entirely true. Serafina never once raised her voice to a servant in 6 years. She never once made anyone in this household feel small for an honest mistake. Elise's face flushed with anger at the comparison, her composure slipping further than Damon had ever seen it slip before. "Do not compare me to her," she said, her voice tight. "I am not some meek, forgettable shadow content to fade into the background of pack life." "No," Damon agreed quietly, something cold settling into his chest as he said it. "You are not." He walked away without further explanation, leaving Elise standing alone in the corridor, and did not look back to see whatever expression crossed her face in his absence. The encounter lingered with him through the following day, resurfacing at odd moments, the memory of the serving girl's frightened, trembling hands, the casual cruelty in Elise's voice, so different from anything he had ever witnessed from Serafina in all their years together. He found himself, more and more, cataloging these small comparisons almost against his will, each one chipping away further at the justification he had built for himself in the months leading up to the ceremony. The morning of their departure for Ravenswood arrived gray and overcast, matching the mood that had settled over the entire delegation as they prepared for the journey. Damon rode at the head of the procession, flanked by Corwin and a handful of senior pack warriors, with Elise positioned in a covered wagon behind them, having declared travel on horseback beneath her dignity for a journey of such distance and importance. They had traveled only half a day when 3 riders appeared on the road ahead, and Damon recognized them immediately as the scouts he had sent forward days earlier to assess conditions along the route to Ravenswood. Fenwick, the lead scout, approached with a caution that immediately put Damon on alert, his young face carrying an expression that suggested news of some significance. "Report," Damon said, drawing his horse to a halt. Fenwick hesitated only a moment before speaking. "We encountered Serafina along the road, Alpha," he said. 2 days passed, traveling toward Ravenswood, alongside the one they call the Feared One. Every muscle in Damon's body tensed at the confirmation, the abstract rumors of the past weeks suddenly crystallizing into something real and immediate, a fact rather than mere speculation. "How did she seem?" he asked, the question escaping before he could fully consider whether he wanted to know the answer. Fenwick studied his Alpha carefully before answering, some old loyalty warring visibly with honesty in his expression. "Strong," he said finally. "Stronger than I have ever seen her, Alpha. She carried herself with more confidence than she did even before the ceremony. Whatever these past weeks have held for her, they have not broken her. If anything, they seem to have done the opposite." The words landed heavier than Damon had expected, a strange mixture of relief and something closer to loss settling into his chest simultaneously. He had spent weeks imagining her suffering, perhaps even hoping, in some dark and unworthy corner of himself, that her suffering might somehow validate the restlessness that had driven him toward Elise in the first place. To hear instead that she had grown stronger, that she had found protection, and, if Fenwick's careful tone suggested anything further, perhaps even happiness, in the company of a man whose reputation could shake entire territories, forced Damon to confront a truth he had been avoiding since Corwin first delivered the news weeks earlier. Whatever he had told himself about Serafina's weakness, about her unremarkable nature, had been wrong from the very beginning, a lie he had constructed to justify a choice his heart had never fully wanted. "Thank you, Fenwick," Damon said quietly. "You may return to your position in the scouting formation." As Fenwick rode ahead to rejoin his companions, Damon remained still on the road for a long moment, staring toward the horizon where Ravenswood territory waited, somewhere beyond the rolling hills still hazy with distance. Behind him, he heard the wagon carrying Elise draw to a halt as well, and moments later, her voice called out, sharp with impatience. "Why have we stopped? We are already behind schedule." Damon did not answer immediately, his thoughts still tangled around Fenwick's report, around the image forming in his mind of Serafina, strong and confident, walking beside a man whose very name commanded fear and respect throughout the region. He thought of the platform, the candlelight, the words he had spoken so carelessly in front of the entire pack, and felt, for the first time with full and undeniable clarity, the true weight of what he had thrown away that night, a weight that no amount of Elisa's demands or complaints could distract him from any longer. "We continue on," he said finally, urging his horse forward once more, though something in his chest had shifted permanently, a certainty settling over him that whatever awaited him at the gathering hall in Ravenswood, he would not be able to face it as the same man who had ridden out from Blackthorn's gates that morning. The reckoning Corwin had warned him of weeks earlier was drawing steadily closer now, inevitable and unavoidable, and Damon rode toward it with a growing dread that had nothing to do with fear of the feared one's reputation, and everything to do with the fear of finally facing, in full and undeniable clarity, exactly what his own choices had cost him. The neutral hall at Ravenswood rose from the center of the territory like a monument, built to remind every visiting pack of the fragile peace they all depended upon, its stone walls ancient and weathered, its great doors carved with symbols representing every major pack within 100 miles. Serafina stood before those doors beside Cale, watching delegations from a dozen different territories filing inside, their banners and colors marking allegiances that had shifted and shaped the politics of this region for generations. "Are you ready?" Cale asked quietly, his gray eyes studying her face with the same careful attention he had shown her since the night he found her collapsed in the forest. "I do not know," Serafina admitted honestly, "but I do not think readiness is something I can wait to feel completely, before walking through those doors." Cale's hand found hers briefly, steady and warm, and something in the simple gesture settled the last of the nervous tremor that had been building in her chest since they first glimpsed the hall's towers rising above the tree line that morning. "Whatever happens inside," he said, "you do not walk in alone." They entered together, and Serafina felt the shift in the room's attention almost immediately, conversations pausing, heads turning, the particular quality of silence that follows recognition, rippling outward from the doors like a stone dropped into still water. She had expected curiosity, given everything Mira and the merchant and Fenwick had warned them to anticipate, but the intensity of it still struck her. Dozens of unfamiliar faces studying her with open interest, some with sympathy, others with the calculating assessment of alphas weighing new information against old alliances. The hall itself was vast, its high ceiling supported by carved wooden beams, its floor space divided into sections marking each pack's designated area, with a raised dais at the far end, where the council elders would preside over the gathering's formal business. Serafina kept close to Cale as they moved through the crowd, searching for the section reserved for those attending without formal pack affiliation, a small designation that nonetheless carried its own kind of weight, given who accompanied her. They had barely settled into their designated space when a ripple of new attention moved through the hall, and Serafina turned to see the Blackthorn delegation entering through the great doors, Damon at its head, flanked by Corwin and several senior warriors, with Elise trailing slightly behind, in an elaborate gown that seemed determined to announce her presence to every corner of the hall. Serafina felt her breath catch, an old and familiar tightness gripping her chest at the sight of him, though she noted, almost distantly, that the pain felt different now than it had the night of the ceremony, less like an open wound, and more like the ache of a scar that had healed imperfectly, but had nonetheless healed. Damon's eyes found hers almost immediately across the crowded hall, and she watched something complicated move across his face, shock giving way to something that looked, unexpectedly, like genuine anguish. "He is watching you," Cale murmured beside her, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "Let him watch," Serafina said, and found her voice steadier than she had expected, carrying none of the tremor she had feared might betray her composure in this moment. The formal business of the council gathering began soon after, elders taking their positions on the raised dais, calling the assembled delegations to order for the first round of border disputes and trade negotiations that formed the practical purpose of such gatherings. Serafina found herself only partially attending to the proceedings, her awareness split between the formal debates unfolding at the front of the hall and the persistent weight of Damon's occasional glances finding her across the crowded space, each one carrying a complicated mixture of longing and regret she had not expected to see so plainly written across his features. It was during a brief recess, as delegations mingled and refreshments were served along the hall's perimeter, that the moment arrived which would reshape everything Serafina had believed about her own place in this gathering, and about the man who had spent these past weeks quietly protecting her. An elder council member, a stern-looking wolf named Baldric, who Serafina recognized as one of the region's most senior and respected figures, approached their small section with a formality that immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby. He stopped before Kale, and to Serafina's astonishment, inclined his head in a gesture of deep respect. "It has been many years," Baldric said, "since the feared one has graced a council gathering with his presence. The council extends its gratitude for your attendance." A murmur rippled through the surrounding delegations at this exchange, dozens of eyes turning toward their small section with renewed and sharper interest. Serafina watched Kale accept the greeting, with characteristic economy, a small nod, a few measured words of acknowledgement, but something in the exchange had already shifted the entire room's understanding of who stood among them. What happened next unfolded so quickly, and with such startling clarity, that Serafina would replay the moment in her memory for years afterward, turning it over and over like a treasured stone worn smooth by handling. A second figure approached, this one carrying himself with an authority that immediately marked him as someone of significant standing, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark cloak marked with an emblem Serafina did not recognize but that clearly commanded respect throughout the hall, given the way conversations stilled and delegates parted to allow his passage. He stopped before their small section, and his eyes moved first to Kale, then settled, with unmistakable and deliberate purpose, on Serafina herself. "Lady Serafina," the man said, and something in the formal weight of the address made Serafina's breath catch entirely. "I had hoped to meet you before the gathering's business concluded." "I do not believe we have been introduced," Serafina said carefully, unsure of the protocol required for whatever this exchange represented. "Forgive me," the man said. "I am Alaric, of the Western Council seat. I have long been an ally of Kale's, from years predating the war that earned him his reputation throughout this region." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, growing more serious, more deliberate. "I have also long carried knowledge that few others in this hall possess, knowledge I believe the time has finally come to share, given the circumstances that have brought you both to this gathering." The hall around them had grown noticeably quieter, delegates and elders alike drawn by the unfolding scene, sensing that something significant was about to unfold before them. Serafina felt Kale go very still beside her, his attention fixed entirely on Alaric now, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes. "What knowledge?" Serafina asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried clearly in the hushed hall. Alaric held her gaze steadily. "Your grandmother," he said, "was not simply a common wolf, raising an orphaned granddaughter on the edges of Blackthorn territory, as pack records have always claimed. She was born of the old Ravenwood bloodline, a lineage of true alphas that predates even the current council structure by several generations, a bloodline that was believed extinguished during the same war that first earned Kale his reputation. She fled with you when you were still an infant, hiding your true heritage to protect you from those who sought to eliminate the last remnants of that bloodline entirely." Serafina felt the words land like physical blows, each one reshaping her entire understanding of her own history, of the grandmother who had raised her with quiet love, and had died when Serafina was still young, taking whatever secrets she carried to a grave Serafina had never thought to question. "That cannot be true," she said, though even as she spoke the denial, something in her chest, some old and unexplainable instinct, recognized the truth of what Alaric was saying. "I have proof," Alaric said gently. "Records preserved by the Western Council, documentation of the Ravenwood bloodline's final surviving members, matched against the knife you carry even now, the one your grandmother is said to have given you before her death. That knife bears the Ravenwood crest, worn smooth by age but still visible to those who know precisely what to look for." Serafina's hand went instinctively to the small knife tucked at her belt, the one her grandmother had given her, the only piece of family she had carried with her through every hardship of these past weeks. She had never thought to examine it closely for any hidden marking, had simply treasured it as a memento of the only family she had known. "The Ravenwood bloodline," Kale said slowly, his voice carrying a weight Seraphina had never heard from him before, was believed to carry not simply noble blood, but a particular strength of connection to the old pack magic, a strength that made every surviving member a natural leader, regardless of whatever circumstances of birth might have obscured their true heritage. Precisely, Alaric confirmed, which explains, I believe, why even a pack as powerful as Blackthorn found itself drawn to name Seraphina as its intended Luna, despite her apparent lack of formal noble standing. Fate itself was recognizing what pack records had long since forgotten. The implications of this revelation settled slowly over Seraphina, layer by layer, reshaping not simply her understanding of her own past, but the entire framework through which she had understood her rejection, her exile, and everything that had followed. She was not simply an orphan who had been fortunate enough to catch a bonded alpha's attention. She was the last surviving heir of a bloodline so significant that its rediscovery could reshape the political balance of the entire region. Cale turned to look at her fully then, something fierce and protective and unmistakably proud moving behind his gray eyes, and without warning, without any hesitation that might have suggested reluctance or calculation, he knelt before her, right there in the crowded hall, in full view of every delegation gathered for the council's business, in full view of Damon Voss and the entire Blackthorn pack he had once commanded her to leave behind. A collective gasp moved through the hall, dozens of voices rising in astonished murmur, as the entire assembly witnessed what none of them, Seraphina included, had ever thought they would see. The feared one, a wolf whose reputation had ended wars and made entire packs tremble at the mere mention of his name, a man who was said to bow to no council, no alpha, no authority beyond his own considered judgment, knelt before Seraphina Cole with his head bowed and his hand extended, offering a gesture of fealty so complete and so public that no one in that hall could mistake its meaning. "My lady," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the hall. "Whatever title you choose to claim, whatever path you decide to walk forward from this moment, I offer you my strength, my protection, and my loyalty, freely and without condition, for as long as you will have it." Seraphina looked down at him, this quiet, scarred man who had pulled her from the forest floor and asked for nothing in return, who had shared his shelter and his solitude, and eventually his deepest guarded truths, now kneeling before her in front of the very people who had once watched her cast aside, without a single voice raised in her defense. She felt tears rise unbidden, not from sadness this time, but from an overwhelming rush of feeling too large to name simply, gratitude, and love, and vindication, all tangled together into something that stole her breath entirely. Across the hall she was aware, distantly, of Damon standing frozen among his delegation, his face pale with the dawning realization of exactly what he had cast aside that night on the platform, watching, as the woman he had rejected for being unremarkable, now stood revealed as the heir to a legendary bloodline, honored by the most feared and respected wolf in the entire region. "Rise," Seraphina said finally, her voice thick with emotion, but carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "I do not need you kneeling before me to know your loyalty. I have known it since the night you found me, long before either of us understood what tonight would reveal." Cale rose slowly, and as he stood before her once more, something had shifted permanently between them, witnessed now by an entire hall full of alphas and elders, who would carry word of this moment back to every corner of the region. Seraphina understood, standing there in the center of so much stunned attention, that whatever life awaited her from this moment forward, it would bear no resemblance to the quiet, unremarkable existence Damon had once dismissed her as suited for. She was Ravenwood blood, protected by the feared one himself, and the world that had once cast her aside so carelessly was about to learn precisely how badly it had misjudged her. The hall remained in a state of hushed astonishment for several long moments after Cale rose to his feet, delegates exchanging whispered conversations, elders on the raised dais conferring quietly among themselves, the entire gathering recalibrating its understanding of the two figures standing at its center. Baldric, the elder who had first greeted Cale with such formal respect, stepped forward once more, and this time his attention settled fully on Seraphina, his weathered face carrying an expression of genuine reverence. "If Alaric's records prove accurate," Baldric said, "and I have no reason to doubt a council seat's word on such matters, then the council owes you a formal acknowledgement, Lady Seraphina. The Ravenwood bloodline has been considered extinguished for 2 generations. Your presence here tonight changes a great deal about how this council must consider matters of succession and territorial claim throughout the region. I do not seek territorial claims, Serafina said, finding her voice steadier now, the initial shock of the revelation settling into something she could speak through with growing clarity. I seek only to live honestly with the people I have come to trust. A commendable sentiment, Baldric said, though I suspect the council, and indeed every pack within these walls, will have opinions of their own about what your bloodline means for the future of this region, whether you seek such attention or not. As if to prove his words immediately correct, Serafina became aware of movement near the Blackthorn section of the hall, and turned to see Damon making his way through the crowd toward them, his expression a complicated mixture of shame and desperate urgency that made her stomach tighten with old, familiar dread. Corwin followed close behind him, his own expression carrying a kind of cautious hope that Serafina did not fully understand until Damon stopped before her, his golden eyes searching her face with an intensity she remembered from the earliest days of their bond, before restlessness and ambition had hardened him into someone else entirely. Serafina, he said, his voice low, meant only for her, though the surrounding hall strained to hear regardless. I did not know about your bloodline, about any of this. Would it have changed what you did? Serafina asked, and found the question emerged without bitterness, simple curiosity rather than accusation, though she watched it land on Damon with the weight of a genuine blow regardless. He hesitated, and something in his hesitation told her more than any answer could have. I would like to believe it would not have mattered, he said finally, that I would have recognized your worth, regardless of what blood ran in your veins. But I cannot say that with honesty, not after everything I have learned about my own failures these past weeks. I judged you unfairly long before I knew anything about Ravenwood blood. That failure belongs to me alone, and no revelation about your heritage changes the wrongness of what I did that night. Something in his admission, delivered with a rawness she had not expected from the confident, careless alpha who had rejected her on that platform, softened the edge of old anger she had carried, though it did nothing to erase the deeper wound his cruelty had left behind. I appreciate the honesty, she said carefully, but I am no longer the woman who needs to hear it from you to know her own worth, Damon. I found that understanding somewhere else, in these past weeks, with someone who never once needed to know my bloodline to recognize what I was worth. Her gaze flicked briefly to Cale, standing steady and protective beside her, and Damon followed the direction of her attention, something bleak and understanding settling over his features as he absorbed the full weight of what had grown between them during her exile from Blackthorn lands. I see, Damon said quietly. I have no right to ask anything more of you. I only wished you to know that I understand, now, what I threw away that night. Whatever comes next for the pack, for myself, I carry that understanding with me, regardless of anything this council decides. He stepped back then, some of the desperate urgency draining from his posture, replaced by a kind of resigned acceptance that Serafina found, unexpectedly, almost harder to witness than his earlier desperation. She had spent weeks imagining various versions of this confrontation, some angry, some triumphant, but she had not fully prepared herself for the quiet devastation of watching a man finally understand, too late, the true value of what he had discarded. Behind Damon, Elise had made her way through the crowd as well, her expression carrying none of Damon's genuine regret, instead sharpening into something calculating as she took in the full scope of what had just been revealed about Serafina's standing. How convenient, Elise said, her voice carrying an edge of forced lightness that did not fully mask the tension beneath it. That a rejected Luna suddenly discovers noble blood, just in time to secure the protection of the region's most feared wolf. One might almost wonder at the timing. The insinuation hung in the air, and Serafina felt Cale tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully controlled, his gray eyes settling on Elise with an intensity that made the human woman take an involuntary step back despite herself. The council's records are not so easily manufactured, Alaric said, his voice cutting through the tension with clear authority. I would advise caution before questioning documentation preserved by the Western Council for 2 generations, madam. Such accusations, made without evidence, carry consequences of their own within these walls. Elise's composure flickered visibly at the rebuke, delivered so publicly and with such clear authority, and Serafina watched something like genuine fear cross her features before she mastered it once more, retreating half a step closer to Damon's side, though he made no move to comfort her, his attention still fixed, distant and troubled, on Serafina. "We should return to our section," Elise said quietly to Damon, an edge of urgency in her voice now that had not been present moments before. "This is not the place to air such matters." Damon did not immediately move, his gaze still lingering on Serafina, with an expression she could not fully name, some tangled mixture of loss and admiration, and old, unspoken longing. Finally, he inclined his head toward her, a gesture that carried more genuine respect than anything he had offered her during their entire bonded partnership, and turned to follow Elise back toward the Blackthorn section of the hall, leaving Serafina standing once more beside Cale, surrounded by the continuing murmur of a gathering still processing everything it had just witnessed. "Are you well?" Cale asked quietly, once the immediate crowd around them had begun to disperse, delegations returning to their own conversations, though Serafina remained acutely aware of the many eyes still tracking her movements throughout the hall. "I am," Serafina said, and found the answer surprisingly true as she spoke it, a settled calm, replacing the anxious dread that had built throughout the journey to Ravenswood. "It is strange, facing him again after everything, and finding that the pain I expected did not arrive the way I thought it would. What I feel now is closer to relief than anything else." "Relief that it is over," Cale said, understanding immediately. "Relief that I survived it," Serafina corrected gently, "and that I did not simply survive, but became someone stronger in the process, someone he no longer recognizes, someone even I did not fully recognize until tonight." Cale studied her for a long moment, something warm and unmistakably proud settling into his expression. "You were always that person," he said. "Blackthorn simply failed to see it. Tonight, the rest of the world finally caught up to what I recognized the moment I found you in those woods." The formal business of the council gathering resumed shortly after. Delegates returning to their designated sections as elders called the assembly back to order, though the earlier proceedings now felt almost incidental against the weight of what had just transpired. Throughout the remainder of the evening session, Serafina found herself the subject of continued and unmistakable interest, delegates from various packs approaching during breaks to offer formal introductions, careful expressions of respect that would have been unthinkable only hours earlier, when she had entered these halls as nothing more than a rejected Luna, seeking anonymity among the crowd. Baldric approached once more, as the evening session drew toward its close, his expression carrying the careful formality of someone preparing to deliver news of significant weight. "The council will require further discussion of these developments," he said, addressing both Serafina and Cale together. "The Ravenwood bloodline's return carries implications for territorial claims and succession matters that will need to be formally addressed. I would ask that you both remain in Ravenswood for the council's continued session, rather than departing immediately as originally planned." Serafina glanced at Cale, uncertain how to answer such a formal request, but found him already nodding, his expression thoughtful rather than reluctant. "We will remain," he said, "for as long as the council requires." As Baldric withdrew to confer once more with his fellow elders, Serafina allowed herself a long moment to simply breathe, to absorb the full weight of everything that had unfolded within these ancient stone walls since they had first stepped through the great doors that morning. She had arrived at this gathering prepared to face humiliation, prepared to endure whatever cruel reminder of her rejection Damon's presence might bring, and had instead walked away with a revelation that reshaped her entire understanding of who she was and what she was capable of becoming. "Whatever the council decides," she said quietly to Cale, as they made their way toward the private quarters arranged for their continued stay. "I do not want to lose what we built together in those quiet woods. Whatever titles or claims this bloodline brings, I do not want them to change what exists between us." Cale stopped, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes steady and warm in the torchlight of the hall's corridor. "Nothing this council decides could change that," he said, his voice carrying a certainty that settled deep into her chest, easing the last of her lingering uncertainty. "Whatever you become, wherever this path leads you, I will walk it beside you, exactly as I have these past weeks. That was never conditional on titles or bloodlines, Serafina. It was only ever conditional on you." Serafina felt tears rise once more, warm and grateful, and allowed herself, finally, to lean into the steady strength of the man who had found her broken in the forest, and had spent every day since building her back into someone capable of standing tall, in a hall full of alphas and elders. Someone the most feared wolf in the region had knelt before without hesitation. Whatever awaited them in the council's continued deliberations, whatever reckoning still remained for Damon and the pack he had nearly destroyed through his own careless cruelty, Seraphina understood, standing there in the quiet corridor, with Cale's steady presence beside her, that she had already won the only victory that truly mattered. She had reclaimed her own worth, on her own terms, and found someone willing to honor that worth, without condition or hesitation. The council reconvened the following morning, and word had already spread through Ravenswood territory overnight, so that by the time Seraphina and Cale arrived at the Great Hall, a larger crowd than the previous day had gathered, delegates and observers alike drawn by rumors of the revelation that had unfolded during the previous session. Seraphina felt the weight of countless eyes as she took her place beside Cale in the section now formally designated for them, no longer the anonymous corner reserved for the unaffiliated, but a position of honor near the front of the hall, close enough to the raised dais that every word spoken there would reach them clearly. She had barely settled into her seat when Damon rose from the Blackthorn section, his expression set with a determination that immediately put her on alert. He approached the raised dais where Baldric and the other elders presided, and requested, with formal correctness, permission to address the council on a matter of pack law. "Speak," Baldric said, though something cautious had entered his tone, as though he suspected what was coming, and did not entirely welcome it. "I wish to invoke the ancient right of mate reclamation," Damon said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "As Seraphina Cole's originally fated mate, I retain certain rights under the old pack laws, rights that predate any territorial claim or bloodline revelation now under this council's consideration." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled delegates, and Seraphina felt her stomach drop, old dread resurfacing, despite everything she had rebuilt these past weeks. Beside her, Cale went very still, his gray eyes fixed on Damon, with an intensity that carried a warning even from across the crowded hall. "Explain this claim," Baldric said carefully. "The old laws state," Damon continued, "that a rejected mate retains the right to seek reconciliation within a period of one full turning of the seasons, provided the rejecting party demonstrates genuine remorse and offers appropriate restitution for the harm caused. I stand before this council today to formally offer that restitution and to request that Seraphina consider reclaiming the bond between us." Seraphina rose to her feet before she had fully decided to do so, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion building in her chest. "I do not consent to this," she said. "Whatever old law you cite, it cannot force a reconciliation neither party wishes to pursue." "The law does not require your immediate consent," Damon said, and something in the careful way he spoke the words told her he had researched this claim thoroughly, had perhaps spent every day since the previous session's revelation searching for some legal foundation to reclaim what he had so carelessly discarded. "It requires only that the council consider the claim formally, and that you be given the opportunity to hear the full terms of restitution before rendering your final decision." Baldric conferred quietly with the other elders for a long moment, and Seraphina felt the weight of the entire hall's attention pressing down on her. The outcome of this council session suddenly far less certain than she had believed only moments earlier. She had thought, walking into this hall that morning, that the previous day's revelation had settled matters clearly in her favor, that Damon's claim on her had ended the moment he spoke his rejection in front of the entire pack. She had not anticipated that ancient pack law might offer him a path back toward reclaiming what he had thrown away. "The claim is technically valid," Baldric said finally, and Seraphina's heart sank at the words, "under the strictest reading of the old laws governing mate reclamation." However, he paused, and something in his tone shifted, growing more formal, more deliberate. "The same old laws that permit such reclamation also carry specific conditions regarding the circumstances of the original rejection. I would ask the council's legal scholars to review those conditions carefully before this matter proceeds further." It was at this moment that Cale rose from beside Seraphina, and the hall fell into immediate, watchful silence, every delegate aware that the feared one rarely spoke in formal council matters, his presence at the previous day's session alone having already reshaped the gathering's entire dynamic. I would ask the council's permission to address this matter directly, Kale said, as one with particular knowledge of the old pack laws governing rejection and reclamation. Permission granted, Baldric said, visible relief in his expression at the prospect of deferring to expertise he clearly trusted. Kale turned to address the hall fully, his voice carrying the same quiet authority Seraphina had witnessed only once before, during the confrontation with the Ashgrove scout weeks earlier. The old laws regarding mate reclamation, he said, were written to protect mates from casual or hasty rejection, to give an alpha who acted in a moment of poor judgment the opportunity to make amends before permanent damage was done to the bond. But those same laws include a critical condition that Alpha Voss has conveniently failed to mention in his petition to this council. He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle over the hall before continuing. The right of reclamation applies only when the original rejection was conducted privately, without public humiliation of the rejected mate. The law explicitly denies this right to any alpha who rejects a mate publicly, before witnesses, in a manner designed to inflict maximum shame and dishonor upon the rejected party. Alpha Voss did not simply reject Seraphina Cole. He did so on a ceremonial platform, before 300 witnesses, using language calculated to diminish her worth in front of her entire community. Under the very law he now invokes, that public humiliation permanently forfeits his right to ever seek reclamation. The hall erupted into astonished murmurs, delegates turning to confer with one another as the full weight of Kale's citation settled over the gathering. Seraphina watched Damon's face pale as he absorbed the implication, his careful legal strategy collapsing beneath the weight of a condition he had either overlooked or, more likely, had hoped no one present would remember clearly enough to cite against him. This is a matter of interpretation, Damon said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. The distinction between public and private rejection is not always. It is not a matter of interpretation, Baldric interrupted, his tone sharpening with the authority of someone whose own legal knowledge had just been confirmed by an unimpeachable source. The law is explicit on this point, and Kale's citation matches the council's own records precisely. Alpha Voss, your petition for reclamation is denied. The manner of your original rejection permanently forfeits any claim to reconciliation under pack law. Damon stood frozen at the center of the hall, the weight of the ruling settling visibly over him, whatever hope he had carried into this session, collapsing entirely in the face of a legal precedent he had apparently failed to fully research before making his claim. Seraphina felt something complicated move through her, not triumph exactly, but a kind of quiet vindication, the sense of a wrong finally being formally acknowledged and corrected, even if it came far too late to undo the pain of that original night. But the session was not yet finished. As Damon returned, defeated, to his section of the hall, a new commotion arose near the Blackthorn delegation, and Seraphina turned to see a young serving woman being escorted forward by two of Baldric's attendants, her expression frightened but resolute, as though she had steeled herself for this moment, despite considerable fear. "What is this?" Baldric asked. "My lord," the young woman said, her voice trembling, but audible throughout the now hushed hall. "I served in the Blackthorn household these past weeks, in the kitchens. I have witnessed things I believe this council should know, regarding the human woman who now stands beside Alpha Voss." Seraphina recognized her immediately as the serving girl Damon had defended weeks earlier, the one whose shattered bowl had prompted his intervention against Elisa's cruelty. She watched Elisa's face drain of color as the young woman continued, her testimony delivered with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed these words many times, in anticipation of finally having the courage to speak them. The human woman, Elise, arrived at Blackthorn territory nearly a year before the rejection ceremony, the serving girl said. She did not simply catch the Alpha's eye by chance, as the pack has been led to believe. I overheard her, on several occasions, speaking privately with a traveling merchant about payments received for information regarding pack vulnerabilities, about deliberate efforts to insert herself into the Alpha's confidence over many months, long before any bond was ever threatened. The hall fell into stunned silence as the implications of this testimony settled over the gathering. Seraphina watched Elisa's composure shatter entirely, her earlier calculated confidence giving way to visible panic as every eye in the hall turned toward her with new and considerably less sympathetic attention. "This is a lie," Elise said, her voice rising with desperate urgency. "A jealous servant's fabrication, nothing more." I have proof, the serving girl said, producing a folded piece of parchment from within her cloak, with trembling hands. A letter, dropped carelessly in the household corridors, discussing arrangements with a merchant connected to Ashgrove territory. I kept it, uncertain what to do with such knowledge, fearful of what might happen to me if I spoke against a woman the Alpha had chosen. But after witnessing yesterday's proceedings, after seeing the truth about Lady Seraphina finally acknowledged, I found the courage to bring this forward. Baldric accepted the parchment, reading it carefully while the hall waited in tense silence, before passing it to his fellow elders for their own examination. This letter, Baldric said finally, his expression grave, appears to confirm a deliberate scheme to destabilize Blackthorn Pack from within, orchestrated in coordination with Ashgrove territory, a scheme that used the manipulation of a bonded Alpha's affections as its primary instrument. Damon rose again, his face a mixture of horror and dawning, devastating understanding, as the full scope of what had happened to his pack, to his own judgment and choices, finally came into focus. Elise, he said, his voice hollow, is this true? Elise's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of his direct question, her carefully maintained facade finally giving way to something raw and desperate. It does not matter how it began, she said, her voice cracking. What I felt for you became real, Damon, regardless of how it started. That is not an answer, Damon said, and something in his voice carried a weight of finality that told Seraphina, watching from across the hall, that whatever remained of his affection for Elise had just been permanently extinguished by the horror of what he was learning. You used the bond I broke, used the pain I caused, as a weapon against my own people, against everything I was sworn to protect. The council's deliberation that followed was swift and decisive. Elise was formally denounced before the assembled delegations, her presence declared unwelcome in any territory represented within the council's jurisdiction, and word was sent immediately to Ashgrove territory demanding explanation for their role in the scheme that had nearly destabilized an entire pack. Elise was escorted from the hall under guard, her protests and pleading growing fainter as she was led away, and Seraphina felt, watching the scene unfold, a complicated mixture of vindication and genuine sorrow for the pack she had once called home, now forced to confront the full scope of the damage wrought by a scheme none of them had recognized until it was nearly too late. Damon remained standing alone at the center of the hall long after Elise's departure, the weight of everything he had learned settling visibly over him. The confident Alpha who had entered this gathering only a day earlier, now reduced to something smaller, more genuinely humbled than Seraphina had ever witnessed from him. I owe this council, and I owe my pack, a period of careful reflection on my own judgment, Damon said finally, addressing Baldric and the assembled elders directly. I request time to properly address the damage done to Blackthorn's stability, and to demonstrate, through action rather than mere words, that I remain worthy of the leadership my pack has placed in my hands. That request will be granted, Baldric said, though the council will monitor Blackthorn's affairs closely in the coming months, given the severity of what has been revealed here today. As the session drew toward its formal close, Seraphina found herself approached once more by Damon, who crossed the hall slowly, his earlier desperate urgency replaced now by something quieter, more genuinely contrite. I do not ask for anything further from you, he said. I only wish to say that I understand, now, completely, why my claim was denied, and why it should have been denied. I am sorry, Seraphina, not simply for the humiliation of that night, but for every failure of judgment that led me there, and for every consequence that failure has brought upon people who deserved far better from their Alpha. Seraphina studied him for a long moment, searching for lingering anger, and finding, instead, mostly a quiet and settled peace, the kind that comes only after a wound has been allowed to fully heal. I accept your apology, she said finally, and I hope, genuinely, that you find your way back to being the Alpha your pack needs. But I will not be part of that journey, Damon. My path lies elsewhere now. She turned back toward Cale, who stood waiting for her with quiet patience, his gray eyes steady and warm, and together they walked from the great hall, leaving behind a pack in the slow, difficult process of rebuilding, and a chapter of Seraphina's life that had finally, fully closed behind her. That evening, as the sun set over Ravenswood territory and the various delegations retreated to their assigned quarters to process everything the day had revealed, Seraphina and Cale walked together through the quiet gardens behind the great hall, a rare pocket of peace amid the storm of revelations that had defined their time in this place. I did not expect any of that, Serafina admitted, settling onto a stone bench beneath an old, sprawling tree, its branches heavy with early autumn leaves. Damon's claim, Elise's scheme, it feels as though an entire lifetime of hidden truths surfaced within the span of 2 days. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Cale said, settling beside her, even when it takes far longer than it should. Elise's arrangement with Ashgrove explains a great deal, in hindsight. The scouts who tested our borders those weeks ago, the sudden interest in confirming rumors about my presence in the region. Ashgrove was likely watching for any sign that their scheme within Blackthorn might unravel, and grew nervous when word spread that you had found protection powerful enough to threaten their carefully laid plans. Serafina considered this, the pieces of the past weeks rearranging themselves into a clearer picture, now that Elise's true purpose had been exposed. "Do you think Damon ever truly loved her?" she asked, "or was he simply manipulated from the very beginning, the way the serving girl's letter suggested?" "I think," Cale said carefully, "that manipulation works best on those already carrying some seed of restlessness or dissatisfaction within themselves. Elise did not create Damon's doubts about your bond from nothing. She found doubts already present, perhaps planted by his own youthful uncertainty about the weight of leadership, and cultivated them skillfully enough to serve her purposes. That does not excuse what he did to you. It simply explains, perhaps, why he proved such an easy target for her scheme." Serafina nodded slowly, absorbing this understanding without the bitterness she might have carried weeks earlier. She found, sitting in the quiet garden with the last light of evening fading around them, that she held no desire for further vengeance against Damon, no need to see him suffer more than the natural consequences of his own choices had already brought upon him. Whatever role Elise's manipulation had played in his original decision, the cruelty of the public rejection had been entirely his own, a choice he would carry the weight of for the rest of his life, regardless of whatever schemes had helped push him toward it. "What happens now?" she asked instead, turning her attention toward the more immediate question of her own future. The council spoke of territorial claims, of succession matters tied to the Ravenwood bloodline. I do not fully understand what any of that means for me. Cale was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. The old Ravenwood territory has remained unclaimed since the bloodline was believed extinguished, he said finally, bordering neutral land to the north, not far from where I first found you, in fact. As the last confirmed heir, the council will likely offer you the right to reclaim that territory, to rebuild what was lost when your grandmother fled with you as an infant. "A territory of my own," Serafina said slowly, turning the idea over in her mind, feeling its weight settle strangely against everything she had believed about her own future only weeks earlier, when she had walked away from Blackthorn, with nothing but a knife and a small pouch of coins. "I do not know if I am prepared for such responsibility." "You are more prepared than you realize," Cale said, reaching over to take her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her knuckles. "I have watched you these past weeks. You learned to survive in unfamiliar woods, with nothing but your own resourcefulness. You faced a hall full of alphas and elders without flinching, even after everything Damon had once done to diminish your confidence. You held your composure through revelations that would have overwhelmed anyone with less inner strength. Leadership is not simply about bloodline or title, Serafina. It is about exactly the qualities you have already demonstrated, again and again, since the night I found you." Serafina felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words, gratitude, and something deeper, something she had been carefully allowing herself to name only in the quietest hours of the night, now settling more firmly into the daylight of open acknowledgement. "Would you stay with me?" she asked softly. "If I chose to rebuild Ravenwood territory? I know how carefully you have guarded your solitude these past years, how much the quiet peace of that hillside shelter has meant to you." "I would stay," Cale said, without hesitation, his gray eyes steady and certain in the fading light. "The solitude I guarded all these years was never truly what I wanted, Serafina. It was simply what remained available to me, after the war left me with a reputation too heavy for most people to see past. You were the first person in longer than I can properly remember who looked at me and saw something beyond the legend, beyond the fear my name inspires in others. I would follow you into whatever future you choose to build, gladly, and without a single moment of regret." The following days brought further clarity to the path ahead. Alaric returned with additional documentation from the Western Council's archives, formal records confirming the full scope of the Ravenwood bloodline's history, along with maps detailing the boundaries of the territory that had remained unclaimed for 2 generations. Baldric and the assembled council elders convened a final session to formally address the matter of succession, and Seraphina found herself, once again, standing before the entire gathered assembly, though this time, the weight of the moment carried anticipation rather than dread. "The council recognizes Seraphina Cole," Baldric announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "as the confirmed and rightful heir to the Ravenwood bloodline, and formally grants her the right to reclaim Ravenwood territory, along with all titles and responsibilities associated with that ancient lineage." A murmur of approval moved through the assembled delegates, considerably warmer than the shocked astonishment that had greeted the initial revelation days earlier, the region's alphas and elders, having had time now to fully absorb and, in most cases, welcome the return of a bloodline long believed lost to history. Seraphina accepted the formal acknowledgement with a steadiness that surprised even herself, the trembling uncertainty of that first revelation replaced now by a settled confidence in the path unfolding before her. Word arrived separately, delivered by a formal envoy from Ashgrove territory, offering profound apologies for the actions of certain individuals within their pack who had orchestrated the scheme against Blackthorn, without the knowledge or sanction of their own alpha. The envoy explained that those responsible had already been identified and formally punished according to Ashgrove's own pack law, and offered restitution to both Blackthorn and to Seraphina personally, an offer the council accepted on behalf of the wronged parties, satisfied that justice, however delayed, had ultimately been served. As the final council session drew to its close, and delegations began preparing for their return journeys to their respective territories, Seraphina found Damon one last time, standing alone near the edge of the Great Hall's steps, watching the Blackthorn delegation prepare their own wagons for departure. Corwin stood nearby, offering quiet counsel that Damon seemed, for perhaps the first time in months, genuinely willing to receive. "I wish you well, Damon," Seraphina said, approaching him one final time before her own departure toward the north, toward the territory that now waited to become her home. "I hope you find your way back to being the leader your pack deserves." "Thank you," Damon said, and something in his expression carried a genuine humility that had been entirely absent from the confident alpha who had rejected her on that platform weeks earlier. "I do not deserve your kindness, after everything, but I am grateful for it regardless." "We are not so different in the end," Seraphina said, "both of us learning, in our own ways, what it truly means to stand on our own strength, rather than relying on titles or bonds we never fully earned. I hope that lesson serves you well, in whatever comes next for Blackthorn." She left him standing there, watching her departure with an expression she chose not to examine too closely, and returned to where Cale waited, with their horses prepared for the journey north, toward Ravenswood's old northern boundary, toward the territory that had waited 2 generations for its rightful heir to finally come home. As they rode away from the Great Hall, the weight of everything that had unfolded during their time at Ravenswood, settling into something Seraphina suspected she would spend years fully processing, she felt, for the first time since the night of her rejection. A sense of genuine excitement about the future stretching out ahead of her, uncertain in its particulars but steady in its foundation, built now on truth rather than fear, on chosen loyalty rather than fated obligation, on a partnership freely given, rather than a bond imposed by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Behind them, Ravenswood's Great Hall grew smaller against the horizon, carrying with it the memory of humiliation finally answered, of truth finally spoken, and of a reckoning that had reshaped not simply Seraphina's own understanding of herself, but the entire political landscape of a region that would spend years absorbing the consequences of everything revealed within those ancient stone walls. Ravenwood territory greeted them with the particular stillness of land that has waited a long time to be remembered. Seraphina stood at the edge of what had once been the old Ravenwood settlement, now little more than scattered stone foundations, overtaken by decades of untended forest growth, and felt something settle deep in her chest, a strange and powerful sense of homecoming, to a place she had never once visited in her conscious memory. "It does not look like much now," Cale said beside her, studying the overgrown ruins with a practical eye. but the bones of it remain sound. The old foundations, the natural boundaries formed by the river, and the ridge beyond. Whatever your grandmother's people built here, they built it to last. Where do we even begin? Serafina asked, though the question carried more wonder than despair, the scope of the work ahead feeling less like an overwhelming burden, and more like the first true challenge she had ever been given the freedom to shape entirely according to her own vision. Wherever you choose, Kale said. This is your territory to build, Serafina. I am simply here to help however you need me. Over the following weeks, word of Ravenwood's reclamation spread throughout the surrounding territories, carried by the same networks of merchants and travelers who had once carried rumors of a rejected Luna sheltering with the feared one. This time, the news carried a different quality entirely, curiosity giving way to genuine interest as neighboring packs began sending emissaries to formally acknowledge the new territory and its leadership, some seeking simple diplomatic courtesy, others hoping to establish early alliances with a bloodline whose historical significance made its return to power a matter of considerable regional importance. The first true test of Serafina's new authority arrived within the month, when a small group of wolves, displaced from a smaller pack that had collapsed under poor leadership in the years since the Old Wars, arrived at Ravenwood's boundary seeking sanctuary. Serafina remembered, vividly, her own experience of being cast out with nothing, and made the decision without hesitation to welcome them, offering shelter and purpose within the growing settlement in exchange for their help rebuilding what remained of the old Ravenwood structures. You are building something remarkable, Mira said, arriving one autumn afternoon on one of her periodic visits, her sharp eyes taking in the growing collection of rebuilt shelters, the small but steadily expanding community that had begun forming around Serafina's leadership. I have watched many territories rise and fall over the years I have wandered these lands, and I have rarely seen one built with such deliberate kindness at its foundation. I remember what it felt like to have nowhere to go, Serafina said simply. I do not wish anyone else who comes to me seeking help to feel that same desperation, if I have the power to offer them something better. Mira studied her for a long moment, something approving in her weathered expression. That instinct, she said, is precisely what separates a true leader from someone who simply holds power without understanding its proper use. Your grandmother would be proud, I think, to see what you have built from the ashes of what she was forced to abandon. Kale, for his part, settled into life at Ravenwood with a quiet ease that surprised Serafina, given how carefully he had guarded his solitude during their years in the hillside shelter. He took on the responsibility of training the growing community's warriors, drawing on decades of hard-won experience, to build a defense capable of protecting the reclaimed territory from whatever threats might eventually test its borders. His reputation, once a burden he carried alone in isolated exile, now served the community directly, neighboring packs treading carefully around Ravenwood's boundaries out of respect, or perhaps caution, for the presence of the feared one, standing openly at its Luna's side. News from Blackthorn arrived periodically throughout that first year, carried by travelers passing between territories, and Serafina found herself listening to such reports with a curiosity that carried no lingering pain, only distant interest in how the pack she had once called home continued to navigate its recovery. Damon, by all accounts, had thrown himself into rebuilding trust with his pack members, working alongside common warriors rather than simply commanding from a distance, personally overseeing the resolution of every dispute that arose from the lingering unrest Elise's scheme had sown throughout the community. Corwin remained his closest advisor, and word suggested that Blackthorn, while still healing, had begun to find its footing again under an alpha who had learned, through hard and public failure, what true leadership actually required. On a clear evening nearly a year after Serafina had first stood before the old Ravenwood ruins, Kale found her standing at the edge of the settlement's central clearing, watching the sun set behind the ridge that marked the territory's western boundary, the same ridge where they had once hidden from the wolves who tested their borders during their earliest days together. You seem thoughtful, he said, settling beside her. I was thinking about how far we have come, Serafina said, from that first night you found me collapsed in the forest. I could not have imagined, even in my wildest hopes, that I would end up here, building something like this. Neither could I, Kale admitted. I had made peace, I thought, with a life of quiet solitude, protecting borders no one else cared to protect. Still, staying carefully removed from the politics and responsibilities I had walked away from after the war. I did not expect to find someone capable of pulling me back into a fuller life, one built around genuine purpose rather than simple survival. Serafina turned to look at him fully, studying the familiar scar along his cheekbone, the steady warmth in his gray eyes, that had, over their year together, become as essential to her sense of home as the land itself. "I have something to ask you," she said, "though I suspect you may have anticipated it already." Cale's expression shifted, something hopeful and carefully restrained moving behind his composed features. "Ask then." "Will you bond with me?" Serafina asked, the question emerging simply, without the elaborate ceremony that had once defined her expectations of such a moment, back when she had stood on Blackthorn's platform waiting for words that never properly arrived. Not because fate has decreed it, not because some invisible thread pulls us together against our will. Because I have chosen you, deliberately and completely, every single day since the night you found me. Because I want to build the rest of my life with you, as an equal partner, in everything Ravenwood is becoming. Cale was quiet for a long moment, and Serafina watched emotion move openly across his features, a rare vulnerability from a man whose reputation had made him a legend of controlled, careful strength throughout the region. "I have wanted to ask you the same question for longer than I have been willing to admit," he said finally, his voice rough with feeling. "I did not want to press you toward a decision shaped by gratitude, or by the strange whirlwind of everything the Council revealed at Ravenswood. I wanted you to choose me freely, with full clarity about who I am and what I can offer you." "I have chosen you freely," Serafina said, reaching for his hand, "with complete clarity. I do not need fate to tell me what my own heart has already decided." Their bonding ceremony, held some weeks later beneath the same ridge where they had once hidden from danger together, bore no resemblance to the grand, ribbon-draped hall where Serafina had once stood, waiting for a rejection she never saw coming. Instead, the ceremony unfolded in the growing settlement's central clearing, surrounded by the community they had built together, warriors and families who had found sanctuary at Ravenwood, standing witness to a joining, built entirely on chosen loyalty rather than fated obligation. Baldric traveled from Ravenswood to preside over the formal proceedings, and Mira arrived as well, her weathered face carrying an expression of genuine warmth as she watched the ceremony unfold. Even a small delegation from Blackthorn arrived, sent by Damon, as a gesture of formal goodwill, Corwin leading the group with a quiet dignity that suggested genuine respect rather than mere political courtesy. As Serafina stood beside Cale, beneath the autumn sky, surrounded by a community built from her own deliberate choices rather than inherited circumstance, she found herself thinking, briefly, of the terrified young woman who had collapsed alone in an unfamiliar forest nearly 2 years earlier, certain that her life had ended the moment Damon spoke his cruel rejection. That woman could not have imagined this moment, could not have foreseen the strength she would eventually discover within herself, the territory she would rebuild from nothing, the partner she would find in the most unexpected and feared corner of the surrounding wilderness. "I choose you," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the gathered crowd, "not because fate demanded it, but because every day since I found you, you have proven yourself worthy of a devotion far greater than any bond could compel. I offer you my strength, my loyalty, and my heart, freely and completely, for as long as we both shall live." "I choose you," Serafina answered, her own voice steady and sure, carrying none of the trembling uncertainty that had defined her words on that platform so long ago, "as my equal, my partner, and the truest home I have ever known. Whatever comes next for Ravenwood, for our people, for the life we continue building together, I choose to face it beside you, freely and without hesitation." As the ceremony concluded and the gathered community erupted into celebration, Serafina allowed herself, finally, to release the last lingering shadow of that night on Blackthorn's platform, the humiliation and fear that had once defined her understanding of her own worth. She was no longer the rejected Luna, discarded and cast aside by a man too restless to recognize what he held. She was Serafina of Ravenwood, heir to a legendary bloodline, builder of a community founded on kindness and genuine strength, bonded freely to a man the entire region had once feared but now, increasingly, had come to respect and even admire for the quiet honor with which he wielded his considerable power. In the years that followed, Ravenwood grew steadily into one of the most respected territories in the region, known not for the fear its leaders inspired, but for the genuine justice and stability they offered every wolf who sought shelter within its borders. Blackthorn, too, found its own slow path toward recovery under Daemon's more humbled and careful leadership, the two territories eventually establishing a cautious but genuine alliance, built on the hard lessons both had learned about the true cost of careless cruelty and the deeper value of earned trust. And on quiet evenings, when the work of leadership finally settled into stillness, Seraphina would often find herself standing at the edge of Ravenwood's growing settlement, watching the sun set behind the familiar ridge, Cale's steady presence beside her, exactly as it had been since the very first night he pulled her from the forest floor and asked for nothing in return. She had lost everything once, in a single cruel moment on a candlelit platform, and had discovered, in the aftermath of that loss, a strength and a love far more enduring than anything fate alone could have provided. The most feared wolf in the region had bowed before her, not because law or legend demanded it, but because he had recognized, from the very beginning, exactly what she was worth, long before the rest of the world finally caught up to that same understanding. And that, in the end, was the truest victory of all. Not the reclaimed bloodline, not the rebuilt territory, not even the formal acknowledgement of a council that had once overlooked her entirely. It was the simple, steady truth of a life built freely, on her own terms, beside someone who had chosen her completely, every single day, without ever once needing fate to compel his loyalty. 2 years after the bonding ceremony, Ravenwood faced its first true test of strength, when a rogue band of wolves, displaced and desperate from territories further south where drought had devastated hunting grounds, attempted to force their way across the northern boundary under cover of night, hoping to seize resources rather than request the sanctuary Seraphina had always been willing to offer those who simply asked. The alarm was raised swiftly, Ravenwood's trained warriors responding with the discipline Cale had spent 2 years carefully instilling, and Seraphina found herself, for the first time since claiming her territory, standing at the front line of a genuine confrontation, her training with the knife her grandmother had given her, finally called upon in earnest rather than simple practice. "Stay behind the shield line," Cale said, positioning himself beside her as the invading wolves emerged from the tree line, their desperation plain in the wildness of their approach. "Let the warriors handle the front. You do not need to prove anything tonight." "I am not trying to prove anything," Seraphina said, though she did stay carefully positioned within the protective formation the warriors had established, understanding the wisdom of Cale's caution, even as her instincts urged her toward the fight. "I simply refuse to hide while my people defend what we have built together." The confrontation, when it came, was brief and decisive, Ravenwood's disciplined warriors making short work of the disorganized invaders, though Seraphina insisted, once the fighting had ended and the invading wolves had been subdued rather than killed, that they be offered the same choice she extended to every desperate soul who arrived at her borders. "You attacked us," she said, standing before the captured leader of the invading band, a gaunt, exhausted wolf who could not meet her eyes, shame and desperation warring visibly across his features. "That choice carries consequences. But I understand. Desperation drove you here, not cruelty. I am offering you and your people a different path. Work to earn your place within Ravenwood's community. Contribute honestly to what we are building here, and you will find shelter and food far more reliable than whatever you hope to seize through force." The wolf looked up at her, disbelief plain in his expression. "Why would you offer mercy to those who attacked your territory?" "Because I remember what it felt like to have nothing," Seraphina said simply, "and because mercy, offered wisely, builds far stronger loyalty than punishment ever could. You will work under close watch until you have proven your intentions are honest, but the choice to earn a place here remains yours to make." The invading band, humbled by both their defeat and the unexpected mercy of their captor, chose overwhelmingly to accept Seraphina's offer, and within months, several among them had become some of Ravenwood's most devoted defenders, their earlier desperation transformed into fierce loyalty toward the territory that had offered them a second chance rather than simple retribution. Word of the incident spread throughout the region, adding yet another layer to the growing legend of Ravenwood's leadership. a reputation built not on the fear that had once defined Cale's isolated years, nor on the careless cruelty that had once defined Damon's leadership at Blackthorn, but on a rare and deliberate balance of strength and genuine compassion. Cale watched this pattern repeat itself again and again over the following years. Seraphina's instinct for mercy tempered always by clear boundaries and consequences, building a territory whose stability rested on trust earned rather than fear imposed. He found himself, more than once, reflecting on how far removed this life had become from the isolated existence he had carved out for himself in the years following the Old War, when he had believed peace could only be found in solitude, in careful distance from the politics and responsibilities that came with genuine leadership. "You have changed the way I understand strength," he told Seraphina one evening, as they walked together through the settlement that had grown, over the years, into a genuine and thriving community, its rebuilt structures now permanent rather than makeshift, its population swelled by wolves from a dozen different displaced circumstances, who had all found, within Ravenwood's borders, the same second chance Seraphina had once needed for herself. "I spent years believing strength meant standing apart, meant carrying power alone, so it could not be used against those I cared for. You have shown me that strength shared, strength built into genuine community, carries far more lasting weight than strength hoarded in isolation." "We built that understanding together," Seraphina said, leaning into his side as they walked. "I could not have rebuilt this territory alone, no matter how much bloodline or council recognition I carried. It took both of us, and everyone who chose to build alongside us, to make Ravenwood into something worth protecting." As the years continued to unfold, Seraphina and Cale's partnership became something of a legend throughout the region, referenced often in the careful diplomatic language of council gatherings and border negotiations, held up as an example of what leadership built on genuine partnership, rather than inherited obligation or careless power, could accomplish. Young wolves throughout the surrounding territories grew up hearing versions of their story. The rejected Luna who found her true worth, reflected back to her by a man feared throughout the land. The feared one, who discovered that true strength lay not in the isolation he had once believed necessary, but in the vulnerability of choosing to build a life alongside someone worthy of his complete trust. Damon, for his part, continued his own slow and steady path toward becoming the leader Blackthorn genuinely needed, his early failures never fully forgotten, but increasingly overshadowed by years of careful, humbled service to his pack. He never bonded again, choosing instead to devote himself fully to Blackthorn's recovery and continued stability, and the occasional formal correspondence that passed between Blackthorn and Ravenwood carried, over the years, a tone of genuine respect, rather than the awkward tension that had once defined their earliest interactions following the council gathering at Ravenswood. On the 5th anniversary of Ravenwood's reclamation, the territory held a formal celebration, drawing delegations from across the region, including a respectful envoy from Blackthorn, led personally by Damon himself, his presence marking the final full circle of a story that had begun with cruelty and humiliation and had transformed, over the years, into something neither participant could have fully anticipated on that candlelit platform so long ago. "You have built something remarkable here," Damon said to Seraphina, during a quiet moment away from the formal celebration, his expression carrying the settled maturity of a man who had spent years genuinely reckoning with his past mistakes, rather than simply moving past them. "I am glad, truly, that the worst night of both our lives led you toward this, instead of toward ruin. We both found our own paths forward," Seraphina said, "in our own ways. I am glad Blackthorn has found stability again under your leadership. Your pack deserves an alpha who has learned what true responsibility requires." As the celebration continued into the evening, fires lit throughout the settlement, warriors and families and delegates from a dozen territories mingling in genuine celebration of everything Ravenwood had become. Seraphina found herself once more at the edge of the gathering, watching the community she had built stretch out before her in the firelight, Cale's steady presence beside her, exactly as it had remained every day since that first night in the forest. "Do you ever think," she asked him quietly, "about how different everything might have been if you had simply walked past me that night in the woods?" "Never," Cale said, without hesitation, his gray eyes catching the firelight as he turned to look at her. "Some choices define the entire shape of a life that follows. Stopping for you that night was never truly a choice at all, Serafina. It was simply the only thing I was ever capable of doing, the moment I recognized what I had found. Serafina smiled, leaning into him as the celebration continued around them, the community they had built together thriving in the warm firelight, a testament to everything that could grow from the ashes of cruelty when met with genuine strength, patient kindness, and a love chosen freely, rather than compelled by fate. The rejected Luna, who had once collapsed alone and broken in an unfamiliar forest, had become something far greater than anyone, including herself, could have imagined on that terrible night. A leader whose strength was matched only by her mercy, standing beside the most feared wolf alive, who had bowed before her, not out of obligation, but out of a devotion that had only grown deeper with every year that followed.